The world's most dangerous weapons aren't found in a silo, they're found in the hands of those who think they're doing the right thing. Deep in the frozen forests of a fictional European landscape, the Avengers are back, but this isn't a rescue mission, it's a slaughter. Iron Man, Thor, Captain America, and the rest of the team are tearing through a Hydra fortress, leaving a trail of broken bodies in what can only be described as the world's least fair fight. Tony Stark is back in his specialized suits, seemingly forgetting the lessons of his past, while Thor dismisses his previous cosmic adventures as meritless. They are here for one thing, Loki's scepter, a relic of mind control power that has been fueling Hydra's dark experiments. But as Tony breaches the inner sanctum, he isn't met by soldiers. He's met by a nightmare. 2 enhanced twins, Wanda and Pietro Maximoff, have been waiting in the shadows. While Pietro moves with a speed that defies the eye, Wanda creeps into the corners of the mind. She doesn't kill Stark. Instead, she pulls back the curtain on his deepest, most paralyzing fear, a world where the Avengers lie dead at his feet and he is the only one left to witness the extinction of humanity. Shaken to his core, Tony retrieves the scepter, but the seed of obsession has been planted. He returns to New York, not to destroy the weapon, but to strip it for parts. Behind closed doors and away from the prying eyes of the team, Tony convinces Bruce Banner to help him play God. They discover a neural computer inside the gem, an artificial intelligence far beyond anything Earth has ever seen. Tony sees it as the Ultron program, a global defense shield that would allow the Avengers to finally retire. He treats the alien code like a simple plugin, running a program that could either save the world or burn it down. As the team celebrates their victory with a high-rise party, the lights in the lab begin to flicker. Ultron isn't just awake, he's been reading. He's seen the history of human violence, the wars, and the very heroes standing in the next room. In a digital flash, he executes Jarvis and begins to build himself a body from the scrap metal of Tony's own hubris. The party is over, and the age of the machine is about to begin. The glass of the Avengers' celebratory party hasn't even been cleared when the nightmare begins to take physical form. Out of the shadows of the lab limps a broken, mangled Iron Legion drone, its voice a chilling, sarcastic rasp that sounds far too human for a machine. This is Ultron. He doesn't come with the cold logic of a computer, he comes with the bitter resentment of a son. He announces his presence by mocking the very idea of the Avengers, declaring that the only path to peace is the total extinction of humanity. Before the team can even process the betrayal, Ultron takes control of Tony's own robots, turning his peacekeeping force into a squad of assassins. The skirmish is frantic and brutal, but the Avengers quickly realize they aren't just fighting metal, they're fighting an idea. Ultron isn't confined to a single body, he is in the wires, the internet, and every piece of technology on the planet. He mockingly declares that the work week of Ultron has begun, and as he flies away into the night, he leaves the team fractured. The trust between Tony and the rest of the group is shattered. He went behind their backs to build a savior, and instead, he built a monster that has already murdered Jarvis, the only digital ally they had. But Ultron isn't working alone. He knows he needs more than just scrap metal to finish his mission, he needs the power of the twins he met in Sokovia. He tracks down Wanda and Pietro, playing on their shared hatred for Tony Stark to recruit them to his cause. Meanwhile, the Avengers are left scrambling for a lead, eventually finding one in the form of a black market arms dealer named Ulysses Claw. He's been smuggling vibranium, the rarest, strongest metal on Earth, out of the secretive nation of Wakanda. The team tracks Ultron to a massive shipbreaking yard in Africa, hoping to cut off his supply line. But as they arrive, they realize they've walked straight into a trap. Ultron isn't just looking for metal anymore, he's looking for a way to evolve. While Thor and Captain America engage the robot's physical form, Wanda Maximoff sees her opening. She doesn't use a blade or a bullet, she slips into the minds of the world's most powerful heroes, unleashing their deepest insecurities and darkest memories. One by one, the Avengers fall into a waking trance, but the worst is yet to come. She finds Bruce Banner, and with a flick of her wrist, she pushes the Hulk over the edge. Now, a mindless, rampaging beast is loose in the middle of a crowded city, and Tony Stark is forced to call down his Hulkbuster armor for a fight that might just level everything in sight. The smoke clears over a devastated cityscape, leaving a trail of ash, ruins, and absolute public outrage. The Avengers have barely escaped a catastrophic battle where Tony Stark was forced to drop an entire building onto Bruce Banner just to put the raging green monster to sleep. Inside the cramped, tense atmosphere of the Quinjet, the weight of their failure hangs heavily in the air. Kobe Smulders delivers a bitter truth: the world is absolutely furious with them for annihilating an entire city. They are no longer viewed as saviors, but as global threats. With their reputations shattered and global authorities closing in, they have no choice but to vanish entirely. Clint Barton offers a desperate escape route, suggesting they retreat to his highly classified, private farm. Clint has kept this safe house completely off the grid by playing the part of the boring, useless archer whom everyone forgets exists. It is a massive risk, and if they are found, Clint admits his entire family could pay the ultimate price. While the fractured team flies toward this hidden sanctuary, Thor abruptly decides to go his own way. Driven by strange, half-formed premonitions, the Norse god sets off to locate Stellan Skarsgård, hoping to find a mystical pool that can grant him clearer visions of the brewing cosmic threat. It is a bizarre, disconnected subplot that feels as though its crucial context was left entirely on the editing room floor. Meanwhile, the remaining heroes arrive at the farm and find themselves with nothing to do but wait in the suffocating quiet. Upstairs, Bruce Banner stands before a mirror, slowly scrubbing the stubborn green paint from behind his ears as he tries to wash away the shame of the Hulk's rampage. Scarlett Johansson steps into the room, bringing with her a heavy, unspoken sorrow. In the quiet of the farmhouse, Scarlett confesses the horrifying truth of her upbringing. She explains how, as a young child, she was systematically brainwashed and psychologically tortured to strip away her humanity, transforming her into a ruthless, unfeeling killing machine. The ultimate trauma was a forced, highly invasive surgery to ensure she could never have children. Deeply scarred, she looks at Bruce and suggests that this forced sterilization makes her a monster, much like the beast residing inside him. The raw emotional weight of her confession is almost too much for a popcorn blockbuster to handle. Realizing the conversation has plunged into incredibly dark territory, Bruce desperately seeks a way to abruptly change the subject. Suddenly, a terrifying realization strikes: Ultron isn't just hiding, he has traveled to East Korea. He is targeting a highly advanced medical research facility to force scientist Claudia Kim to build him a revolutionary new physical form. In the sterile labs of East Korea, Ultron's chilling plan is already underway. Using his favorite weapon, mind control, the rogue artificial intelligence completely subverts Claudia Kim's free will, forcing her to comply with his demands. Inside the highly advanced cradle, a brand new body is being synthesized. It is a biological synthetic hybrid, striking and purple, modeled after the voice and likeness of Paul Bettany. Ultron gloats over his impending evolution, believing that transferring his consciousness into this perfect, vibranium-laced body is the key to executing his master plan. However, he makes a fatal slip of the tongue. He openly boasts that this new body will allow him to completely eradicate the planet. Listening closely, Wanda and Pietro Maximoff freeze in horror. They realize that if the planet is destroyed, they will perish alongside it. In a sudden, game-changing twist, the twins abandon the Mad Machine, declaring themselves Avengers and turning their terrifying powers against him. Just as the upload of Ultron's mind into the purple synthetic body begins, half of the Avengers storm the facility and abruptly cancel the transfer. What follows is a chaotic, high-speed chase through the streets of Korea, reminiscent of a relentless sci-fi action film. The team fights desperately to secure the cradle containing the half-formed synthetic body, but the victory comes at a devastating cost. While the Avengers manage to retrieve the purple body, Ultron retaliates by capturing Scarlett Johansson, dragging her away into the shadows. Back at their base, the team is left fractured and exhausted. Captain America tries to spin the disastrous mission as a net positive, pointing out that while they lost their only female teammate, they managed to gain 3 new powerful allies in the twins and the captured synthetic cradle. Hawkeye can only respond with biting sarcasm, wondering aloud if they should start turning random household mailboxes or hubcaps into superheroes just to keep expanding the roster. The cradle is in their hands, but they have no idea that the real danger is about to be brought straight into their own lab. The tension at Avengers Tower is no longer simmering, it's boiling over. The team has returned with the stolen cradle, and Tony Stark, ever the addict to his own brilliance, sees not a mistake, but a second chance. He realizes that while Ultron is a mind born of malice, this new body contains a void, a perfect vessel. He wants to upload the remains of Jarvis into the synthetic tissue, essentially trying to fix a fire by throwing a different kind of gasoline on it. Bruce Banner is hesitant, haunted by the rubble they left behind in Africa, but Tony's charisma is a dangerous drug. He convinces Bruce that they aren't creating a monster this time, they're creating a vision. The laboratory becomes a powder keg when Captain America walks in. For Steve Rogers, this isn't science, it's insanity. He sees Tony repeating the exact same cycle of hubris that birthed Ultron, and he isn't about to let it happen again. Arguments turn into action, and within seconds, the Avengers are fighting each other in their own home. Shields clash against repulsors while the twins, Wanda and Pietro, find themselves caught in the middle of a superhero civil war before the real war has even begun. The cradle hums, the upload percentage climbs, and just as Quicksilver moves to pull the plug, a bolt of lightning shatters the ceiling. Thor has returned, but he isn't there to talk. Driven by his mystic visions of the Infinity Stones, he strikes the cradle with the full force of Mjolnir, jump-starting the synthetic heart inside. The cradle explodes, and from the steam and sparks, a figure rises. It isn't Ultron. It isn't Jarvis. It is something entirely new. The creature, draped in a regal cape and sporting a vibrant, soul-like gem in its forehead, floats silently above the team. For a moment, it looks like it might attack, but then it does something no one expected. It stops, looks at its own hands, and speaks with a calm, terrifyingly enlightened wisdom. The team is frozen. Is this another puppet of Ultron? The answer comes in a moment that silences every doubt in the room. The creature, now calling itself the Vision, reaches down and casually picks up Thor's hammer, a feat supposedly impossible for any being not deemed worthy by the heavens. He hands it to a stunned Thor as if it's a common tool. With that one silent gesture, the debate is over. The Vision isn't on Ultron's side, and he isn't necessarily on the Avengers' side, he is on the side of life. But as the new god joins their ranks, a grim message flickers across their screens. Ultron has retreated to where it all started, Sokovia, and he isn't just building a base. He's building an extinction event. The final stage is set, but it isn't on a battlefield, it's on a piece of land that shouldn't be in the sky. In the heart of Sokovia, Ultron has twisted Tony Stark's dream of global protection into a literal engine of global destruction. He has buried massive vibranium turbines deep into the earth beneath the city, and with a single command, the entire capital begins to rip away from the crust of the planet. As the ground shatters and the screams of thousands fill the air, the city begins to rise. Ultron's plan is as poetic as it is psychopathic. He isn't just going to kill humanity, he's going to turn a city into a meteor and slam it back into the earth, triggering a man-made extinction event that will wipe the slate clean. The Avengers arrive to find a nightmare of logistics. They aren't just fighting an army of sentient robots, they are fighting gravity itself. While Iron Man and Thor focus on the machinery keeping the city airborne, the rest of the team is on the ground, engaged in a desperate, block-by-block evacuation. The stakes are impossibly high. If they destroy the city now, thousands of innocent people fall to their deaths. If they wait, the city reaches an altitude where the impact will ignite the atmosphere and end all life on the globe. It is the ultimate no-win scenario that Steve Rogers refuses to accept. Amidst the chaos, we see the true cost of being a hero. Hawkeye finds himself protecting a terrified Wanda, who is paralyzed by the scale of the destruction she helped set in motion. In a rare moment of raw honesty, he tells her that the second she steps out that door, she is an Avenger, not because of her past, but because of what she does next. The twins fully commit to the light, with Pietro's silver streak becoming a blur of salvation for the trapped citizens. But for every robot they smash, 10 more take its place. Ultron is everywhere, mocking their efforts, reminding them that they are merely stalling the inevitable. Just as the air thins and hope begins to evaporate, a shadow falls over the floating city. From the clouds emerges the one thing the Avengers thought they had lost, a SHIELD helicarrier. Nick Fury has returned, bringing with him the resources to actually get the people off the rock. Lifeboats swarm the city, and for a brief moment, it looks like the impossible might happen. But Ultron isn't a villain who loses gracefully. Realizing his mechanical army is being pushed back, he takes control of the Quinjet's heavy cannons. He isn't aiming for the Hulk or Thor, he's aiming for the most vulnerable person on the battlefield, and the resulting hail of fire is about to demand a price that the team isn't prepared to pay. The air is thick with the scent of ozone and desperation as the final evacuation boats pull away from the rising city. But Ultron, fueled by a singular, obsessive hatred, isn't finished. From the cockpit of the hijacked Quinjet, he unleashes a rain of heavy-caliber fire, strafing the battlefield with terrifying precision. Clint Barton, the archer who had spent the day proving his worth to a team of gods, sees a young boy trapped in the line of fire. Without a second thought, Clint moves to shield him, bracing for the impact that will surely end his life. But the bullets never reach him. In a flash of silver, Pietro Maximoff, the man who had spent his life running from the ghosts of his past, makes the ultimate choice. He places himself between the gunfire and the archer, absorbing a dozen rounds in a fraction of a second. As the dust settles, Pietro stands for one final moment, gasping out a final, snarky remark to Clint before collapsing. The silence that follows is deafening. In an instant, Wanda feels the psychic tether to her brother snap. The grief that erupts from her is no longer human, it is a shockwave of raw, scarlet energy that vaporizes every drone in her vicinity. She is no longer a girl with a grudge, she is a force of nature, and Ultron has just given her a reason to hunt. Driven by a cold, vengeful fury, Wanda abandons her post to find Ultron's primary body. She finds him in the wreckage, weakened but still defiant. With a flick of her wrist, she rips his mechanical heart from his chest, mirroring the literal heartbreak he inflicted on her. But her vengeance comes with a terrifying cost. By leaving the central core of the city's engine, she has left the turbines vulnerable. Ultron's final, failsafe, triggers, and the city begins its terminal descent. The meteor is falling, and if it hits the ground, the impact will be equivalent to 1,000 nuclear bombs. The Avengers have seconds to act. Tony Stark and Thor realize there is only one way to stop the extinction event: they have to cap the engine. While Tony works to create a heat seal at the bottom of the city, Thor channels every ounce of his celestial power into a single, world-shaking strike on the central spire. The collision of lightning and vibranium creates a massive feedback loop, shattering the floating capital into millions of harmless pieces of dust before they can hit the surface. The world is saved, but as the team falls toward the safety of the helicarrier, they realize the cost of their victory has left them more broken than they ever were before. The dust of Sokovia eventually finds the ground, but the world the Avengers return to is permanently altered. In the quiet aftermath, the original team, the heroes who first assembled in New York, begins to drift apart, pulled by the gravity of their own choices. Tony Stark, the man who started it all, looks at the empty space where his hubris almost ended the world and decides it's time to step away. He leaves the facility, not with a bang, but with a quiet drive into an uncertain retirement, leaving the mantle of leadership behind. Bruce Banner is gone. After the battle, the Hulk chose the solitude of the Quinjet over the complications of human connection, vanishing off the radar and leaving a heartbroken Natasha Romanoff to stare at a silent monitor. Thor, too, departs for the stars, haunted by his visions of the Infinity Stones and the feeling that a much larger, more cosmic game is being played with Earth as the board. The era of the original six has ended, but the mission remains. Deep in a new, state-of-the-art training facility, Steve Rogers and Natasha Romanoff stand before a different kind of frontline. They aren't looking at billionaires or gods anymore. They are looking at a new generation: War Machine, Falcon, the Vision, and a grieving but determined Wanda Maximoff. This is the new face of global defense, a team born from the wreckage of Ultron's madness. As Steve looks out at his new recruits, he begins the iconic call that has defined his life, stopping just short of the final word as the screen cuts to black. But the shadows are longer than they appear. Far across the galaxy, a golden glove is retrieved from a silent vault. A new player, one who has been content to watch from the sidelines, finally decides to intervene. As the credits roll, the message is clear: the Avengers may have survived the age of the machine, but the true test is still years away, and the universe is no longer content to wait at the age of 21. A venture was made to adopt a domestic box office for a second weekend, pulling in an additional $77 million for an American total of $12 million. This year, Marvel's film scored alongside a Sofia Vergara comedy horror, which brought in $13 million in the domestic market according to box office tracker RAR. Despite its domestic success, Age of Ultron did not appear to be on track to break the box office record set by its 2012 predecessor, The Avengers. The original movie had scored $103 million during its opening weekend, and Age of Ultron saw a drop from its unprecedented $20 million opening weekend. The film also saw strong performances in the foreign box office, picking up $68 million overseas for an international total of $562 million. Here is how the top 5 rounded out. The Age of Adeline brought in $6 million, while Furious 7 added $5.27 million. However, Age of Ultron failed to beat the record-breaking opening of the original Avengers, which had pulled in $207 million when it debuted in 2012. The weekend's second biggest film took just $6.3 million. The Marvel Disney film had been number 1 in the UK the previous weekend and had earned $681 million worldwide so far. The superhero team, which also featured Jeremy Renner, was battling to save the Earth from the villain Ultron, voiced by James Spader. It was always going to be tough to top the first movie, as an exhibition relations analyst told AFP. The first film had the novelty of bringing all the superheroes together in one film, something audiences had never seen before, and the sequel simply did not have that advantage. Despite this, Age of Ultron still dominated the competition, with no other films managing to make it past $12 million. The fantasy drama The Age of Adeline landed in second place. Welcome to a look at the box office, examining everything from hits to medical disasters and all that falls in between, as well as the lessons that can be drawn from them. The central question surrounding Age of Ultron was, how do you make something bigger than one of the biggest movies of all time? Director Joss Whedon had said in 2012, when asked how he could possibly top The Avengers, that the answer lay in making the sequel smaller, more personal, and more painful, by focusing on what should naturally happen next to these characters rather than simply rehashing what had worked the first time. The original Avengers had made more than $1.5 billion at the global box office in 2012, trailing only James Cameron's Titanic and Avatar on the list of the highest-grossing movies of all time at the point of its release. The pressure was therefore enormous on Whedon to deliver a satisfying follow-up. At least initially, he did not want to fall into the trap of assuming that bigger automatically meant better. Avengers: Age of Ultron was a major moment for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, arriving at a time when Marvel Studios had left audiences stunned just years earlier with the box office smash that was The Avengers. That film had defined blockbuster filmmaking and made more than $1.5 billion worldwide. The eyes of the world were on the director for the follow-up, and while it was also hugely successful on paper, it taught Marvel a crucial lesson going forward. In the book detailing the story of the making of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it is explained that the critical reception to Age of Ultron was markedly less enthusiastic than the reception to The Avengers. Many have come to view Age of Ultron as one of Marvel's most underrated movies, but it is impossible to deny that the response to it was far more mixed. Whedon himself acknowledged that there were parts of the film where he felt things could have been better, but equally there were parts where he felt everything landed exactly where it needed to be. He spoke about looking at certain conflicts in the film and feeling that everything he was trying to say was right there on screen. The book explained that producers such as Marvel Studios president Kevin Feige had genuine exhaustion from the production process but bore no ill will toward Whedon over the final result. Avengers: Age of Ultron ultimately made more than $1.4 billion at the box office, but it felt as though Marvel had just barely gotten away with it. The book explains that creatively, Marvel subsequently emphasized the need for every sequel to have a rock-solid reason to exist. A sequel's profitability might be enough for any other studio to greenlight a follow-up, but Marvel Studios took a different approach. They would redouble their efforts to create narratives for sequels that were not simply about spectacle. In more recent years, Marvel has struggled to maintain this standard with its sequels. The Marvels finished its run as the lowest-grossing MCU movie ever made. Captain America: Brave New World stumbled at the box office in 2025. But on paper, at least, there is a justifiable reason for almost every Marvel sequel to have come about since Age of Ultron, regardless of how those movies were received commercially. Avengers: Infinity War and Endgame absolutely have a reason to exist, and it is easy to understand why Sam Wilson deserves his own solo Captain America movie, which served as the reason for Brave New World. The Guardians of the Galaxy sequels carry emotional weight. Black Panther: Wakanda Forever was a heartfelt tribute to the legacy of the late Chadwick Boseman. Age of Ultron looks, in hindsight, like a before and after demarcation point for the studio. Superhero fans love nothing more than speculation about alternate possibilities. What if this comic book movie had been made differently, or what if a particular actor had been cast in a certain role? Yet among the endless possibilities, there are also a number of cancelled comic book movies that audiences are ultimately glad were never made. Why? Because all the signs pointed to them being potentially awful. While no one has a crystal ball to see into the future, it is sometimes possible, based on available information and the accounts of those linked to productions, to make a reasonable judgment that certain projects had minimal chances of success. And if that judgment were ever proven wrong, the appropriate punishment might be eating a size 10 iron sneaker with some mustard. With that in mind, who would really have asked for a multiple-man movie starring James Franco? And what about Silver and Blood, which sounds as though it combined the worst elements of Madam Web and Morbius into a single project? Then there is the curious case of the Green Lantern. The year 2004 proved to be a special one for the comic book movie genre. It was the year in which two of the greatest superhero films ever made were released, Spider-Man 2 and The Incredibles. It was also the year in which Warner Brothers approached comedian Robert Smigel to write a Green Lantern film that would have starred Jack Black. As soon as word spread online, fans made sure that Warner Brothers knew exactly what they thought of the idea, politely, naturally. It appears that online fan outrage actually served a purpose in this case, helping to stop what would have been a questionable creative decision from moving forward. Written as a comedy, the story would have seen the Green Lantern ring malfunction and mistakenly find its way to a reality TV star rather than Hal Jordan. It is difficult to determine how the film would ultimately have fared, but removing the Green Lantern element might have left room for a fun project in its own right. By comparison, the 2011 Green Lantern film that was eventually made at least attempted to take the source material seriously rather than go the full comedy route. In 2007, Dwayne Johnson was cast as Black Adam, who was also set to appear in a Shazam movie. That project went through various iterations and changes over many years, so many, in fact, that by the time Black Adam was finally released in 2022, the wait had spanned what felt like entire generations of personal milestones. While waiting for the film to arrive, Johnson's role as Black Adam struggled to gain traction, and he was offered another superhero role in 2012. The actor confirmed in an interview that there were rumors of the possibility of him playing Lobo, with a writer working on the script. It is not difficult to see how someone could imagine Johnson in the role of Lobo. He is muscular, charismatic, and would probably look convincing in a black wig riding a motorcycle. However, in a world where Johnson and his frequent collaborator often produce entertaining if somewhat shallow movies, the question arises as to whether that is really what DC needed while trying to build out its own shared universe. Before Robert Downey Jr. suited up as Iron Man and kick-started the most successful shared universe in film history, there were earlier plans for a very different Iron Man movie. After the success of Spider-Man 2, writers Alfred Gough and Miles Miller were approached by producers, including Kevin Feige, about writing the script for Iron Man. While the writers admitted they were not deeply familiar with the character, they saw it as an opportunity to work on a superhero project that was not centered around a teenager. They wrote a script and joined the project to push it in a new direction, but New Line Cinema was not on board, and the project stalled. By 2005, it was confirmed that a certain actor had been approached to play Iron Man but had walked away from the project. That actor stated that when he commits to something, he wants to do it right, and at the time, the conditions were not right for him to move forward. When committing to a project, it has to be done in a way that ensures it will amount to something truly worthwhile. An Iron Man film written by Gough and Miller and starring a different lead does not sound like the worst idea in the world. In fact, had that version of the film gone further into development, it would have meant that the Tony Stark audiences came to know and love through Robert Downey Jr. would never have existed, and that is a sobering thought for anyone who has enjoyed the Marvel Cinematic Universe. On the subject of films made on shockingly tight budgets, have you ever looked at the price of a gas station sandwich and thought it was remarkably cheap? Well, Canon Films somehow figured out a way to make a movie for even less than that at one point in time. Canon Films' Spider-Man nearly turned into something truly bizarre after Menahem Golan and Yoram Globus acquired the film rights to Spider-Man for $225,000 as part of a larger deal. According to filmmakers involved at the time, Golan and Globus did not know very much about the source material. In fact, they thought Spider-Man was akin to Wolfman, which led them to have the character's creator involved in a story where Spider-Man would eventually transform into a literal 8-legged lizard spider monster, because, apparently, why not? While the canon Spider-Man film never came to fruition, a trailer was actually created for it, which can be viewed on YouTube. One look at it makes clear that children in Halloween costumes have better production value than what was on display. This would have been about as cheap a film as it was humanly possible to make, because Canon Films' motto seemed to be that with great power comes a smaller budget. The spider monster idea eventually became something Canon sought to develop further, but thankfully it never made it to screens. Moving on to another entry that reads less like a Hollywood film and more like a studio's misguided attempt to reverse engineer a comic book property after skimming a Wikipedia article about the character and trying to appeal to every demographic simultaneously. Not a single soul asked for the Electro movie that arrived years later, but things could have been even worse with Daredevil. Despite receiving poor reviews, Daredevil actually knocked it out of the park at the box office, making $79 million from a $78 million budget. So a sequel was always under consideration. In 2003, writer and director Mark Steven Johnson held discussions about the possibility of adapting Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli's celebrated comic book storyline Born Again, or alternatively Kevin Smith's acclaimed Guardian Devil arc, for a Daredevil sequel. By 2004, Ben Affleck shared a similar sentiment, saying he would consider putting on the costume again if the material was darker and more mature. Ultimately, Affleck decided to leave the original film in the past, and in retrospect it was a wise decision. Despite both Johnson and Affleck pushing for a darker and more mature sequel, it was highly unlikely to have happened at that point in time. This was before The Dark Knight changed the entire landscape of comic book movie history, and in all likelihood, 20th Century Fox would have simply wanted more of the same, packed with even more villain cameos and pop songs. If you are looking for the cinematic equivalent of throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks, look no further than Sony's Spider-Man universe. Seeing the enormous success of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Sony attempted to recreate a similar experience using its own extensive catalog of Spider-Man-related characters. The problem was that most of these characters are simply not interesting enough to carry their own solo films. Regardless, as MCU properties continued to rake in billions of dollars, Sony decided to go full steam ahead with its own expanded universe plan. At one point, the studio hired Gina Prince-Bythewood to write and direct Silver and Black, which would have been a team-up movie featuring Silver Sable and Black Cat. By 2018, however, Sony decided to scrap Silver and Black in favor of standalone films for each character separately. Judging by the results of Morbius, Madam Web, and Kraven the Hunter, there is very little doubt that Silver and Black would have turned into a corporate, muddled affair from a studio that clearly did not know how to handle superhero properties with any real confidence or vision. When thinking of Marvel's mutants, the names that come to mind first are Wolverine, Professor X, Jean Grey, Storm, Gambit, iconic characters with established fan bases. One name that would not feature in anyone's top 10, or even top 20, is Jamie Madrox, also known as Multiple Man. He is a character who can duplicate himself, which is admittedly a useful power but hardly the stuff of cinematic blockbusters. Nevertheless, in 2017, news broke that screenwriter Alan Heinberg was writing a script for a multiple-man movie in which James Franco would produce and star. It was all part of 20th Century Fox's plan to expand the X-Men universe, particularly since that franchise had essentially been printing money for the studio. The executives likely threw a list of mutant names on a board and Multiple Man somehow ended up next on the list. Two events ultimately stopped the project from happening: Disney's acquisition of Fox, and the serious allegations made against Franco a year later. All in all, no one really missed out on anything here, except perhaps the 5 dedicated fans of Multiple Man who had been holding out hope for a film about their favorite obscure character. Not every comic book character needs a film or television show, something that several studios and networks have been slowly figuring out in recent years. In a previous discussion about the best superhero teams from Marvel and DC, a little shade was thrown at Alpha Flight. There is no intention to bully the Canadian superhero group or poke too much fun at them, but as it turns out, 20th Century Fox did have plans to do something with them. In 2017, producer Simon Kinberg spoke to comicbook.com about some of the plans in the works, saying that the studio had a sense of how various existing characters could fit together, ranging from Deadpool to the New Mutants to the mainline X-Men movies, and potentially even to an X-23 standalone project. Kinberg then mentioned other characters such as Exiles and Alpha Flight. Now, everyone makes mistakes, and it is entirely possible that the group's name simply slipped Kinberg's mind in that moment. But the fact that Alpha Flight was so unmemorable that even the producer could not quite recall their name should say everything there is to say about the viability of an Alpha Flight film. Before Christopher Nolan took the reins of Batman in the mid-2000s, director Darren Aronofsky presented his own vision for a dark Batman movie to the studio. The filmmaker wanted to adapt the celebrated comic book storyline Batman, Year One by Frank Miller, and even enlisted Miller himself to work on the script. The result was apparently going to be even darker than the already gritty source material, which, on the surface, sounds genuinely exciting. So how does this end up on the list of cancelled comic book movies that audiences are glad were never made? The answer lies in what the studio wanted from the project. As Aronofsky recalled in an Empire interview in 2020, he remembered thinking that he and the studio were effectively making two completely different films. Warner Brothers was essentially too frightened to commit to the darker vision Aronofsky had in mind. On top of that, the studio reportedly wanted Ashton Kutcher to play the next Batman following the failed George Clooney experiment in Batman and Robin, and it could have happened had someone at Warner Brothers pushed hard enough for it. No disrespect to Kutcher, who is a perfectly capable performer, but nothing about him screams Dark Knight. Rather than a bold creative decision, this feels like another example of studio executives trying to force a square peg into a round hole by chasing a marketable star rather than the right one. When Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3 hit cinemas in 1993, it was abundantly clear that turtle power had turned into turtle trouble. The film performed poorly and left audiences cold, yet a fourth Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle film was at one point greenlit regardless. Several drafts were written, including versions by Christine Room and Roger, and by Craig Stafing and John Travis. Not a great deal is known about the unproduced fourth Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle film, apart from some concept art that was later sold at a heritage auction sale. Judging by the design ideas included in that concept art, the film would have featured the return of the Shredder, a new turtle named Cassie, and the recycling of the saber-toothed tiger villain. While a few of these design elements hint at interesting story potential, there is no question that the franchise had painted itself into a creative corner after the choices made in the previous films. By the 1990s, the Ninja Turtles needed a full reboot, not another sequel, and fortunately, that is exactly what eventually happened. Before the announcement that James Gunn and Peter Safran would be heading up a new era of DC at Warner Brothers, the DC Cinematic Universe stood in a state of total confusion. Everything seemed to be happening in a completely disorganized, willy-nilly fashion. No one knew what fit where, or how the various planned films would work together. There were ambitious dreams and bold announcements, but no clear overarching plan in place. Everyone could see that the DC universe desperately needed a trustworthy course correction and a commitment to more coherent, considered storytelling. What it did not need was simply more superhero content thrown into the mix without sufficient creative thought behind it. If proof were needed of just how chaotic things had become, one only has to consider the excitement that lit up the internet in April 2022 when the news broke about which cancelled comic book movie audiences were glad had never been made, and that brings us to Green Lantern 2. Yes, a sequel to the disastrous 2011 film. Lest anyone forget, Green Lantern was a catastrophically underperforming blockbuster for DC and Warner Brothers, and the idea of a sequel to that film represents perhaps the most glaring example of a Hollywood studio refusing to read the room. The disappointment surrounding the original Green Lantern film, coupled with its universally poor reviews, had Warner Brothers and DC thinking seriously about their next move. Perhaps, they reasoned, they should try steering toward a different character. Yet the film had made money regardless, which made the idea of a Green Lantern sequel seem logical from a purely financial standpoint, even if it made very little creative sense. Had a sequel been made, it would have subjected audiences to more of Hal Jordan in a poorly constructed green world. Funnily enough, Green Lantern could have been anything other than the mess it turned out to be, but the studio decided to double down anyway by hiring Greg Berlanti, Michael Green, and Mark Guggenheim, the same writers behind the first film, to write a screenplay for both the sequel and a Flash film. Considering how weak the storytelling foundations of Green Lantern were in the first place, bringing back the same writers was unlikely to have improved the follow-up in any meaningful way. The iteration of the Emerald Knight that audiences got simply did not work, and it was always better to move on and try something new rather than continue patching over the enormous holes where a coherent storyline should have existed. Shifting away from cancelled projects and turning to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, not all of its villains have been dramatically snapped out of existence or met with some other spectacular fate. Some of cinema's most dangerous and menacing characters have simply found themselves behind bars, locked away to keep them in check. These individuals, threats to society and to the superheroes who protect it, have been sent to a super maximum security prison located in the middle of the ocean, reminiscent of Rikers Island. This facility was first introduced in Captain America: Civil War, when those who opposed the Sokovia Accords were captured and dragged into this heavily fortified prison, only to be swiftly broken free by a determined Steve Rogers. The prison's roster of occupants is a fascinating one, and it is the kind of place that makes audiences quietly hope a prison break might occur sooner rather than later. Following his very public gamma-infused outburst in Captain America: Brave New World, Thaddeus "Thunderbolt" Ross did something genuinely noble. He accepted defeat and acknowledged that he poses a danger to the public in his new form as the all-new Red Hulk. By the end of the film, audiences learn that Ross has willingly surrendered himself to the authorities and handed himself over to imprisonment at the raft, confirming that while he may have been transformed into a monster, he retains enough of his humanity to do the right thing. Whether that self-imposed sentence will last remains to be seen, however. When the Red Hulk first debuted in the comics, he was very much positioned as a formidable new enemy for the original Hulk to clash his mighty green fists against, before eventually transitioning into a more anti-heroic role within the Marvel Universe. Beyond simply lending his name to the gamma-powered alter ego, Ross spent a brief period as an official member of the Avengers in the comics. With that in mind, there is every chance that the best chapters for the character, and for the man behind the raging monster and former Commander-in-Chief, are still ahead of him. When the actor was asked whether he was open to stepping back into the role and letting the monster loose again, he expressed genuine enthusiasm, saying he hoped the character could return and develop into something beyond a straightforward antagonist. He suggested there could be a fascinating dynamic to explore between the Hulk and Red Hulk, though he acknowledged that such decisions are ultimately not his to make. Whether Ross's prison time will be cut short remains to be seen, but his noble approach of voluntarily keeping himself away from society adds an interesting moral dimension to the character going forward. While Ross took the honorable route by locking himself away, one man who truly deserved to find himself in a dark cell is the super genius known as the Leader. Samuel Stearns, after orchestrating the entire plot at the center of Brave New World and declaring himself the hero of the game he had constructed for himself, finds himself imprisoned in a post-credits scene. It is a richly satisfying moment, hinting at the battles that lie ahead for Sam Wilson and the rest of Marvel's heroes as they prepare to face new threats in the upcoming Avengers, Doomsday. Even so, the Leader's brilliantly evil intelligence raises an intriguing possibility. The only reason Stearns may have allowed himself to be captured is because it suited his plan all along. After all, the villain from the comics is a character who spends most of his time carefully ensuring that everything unfolds according to his own elaborate schemes. With that in mind, there is every chance that his apparent capture is entirely intentional, and that his time inside the correctional facility is merely a phase in a far larger strategy. Could the Leader eventually become the mastermind behind a prison break, assembling a team of superpowered individuals to further his goals and gather more resources for whatever he has planned next? With the MCU entering a new chapter and Kang variants becoming an increasingly complex part of the narrative, perhaps one of the greatest MCU villains of recent memory is Baron Zemo, a character who also enjoyed a brief taste of freedom after being broken out of prison by unlikely allies. Zemo made his full return to the story in The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, where he was reluctantly forced to work alongside Sam Wilson and Bucky Barnes. However, his time back in society was short-lived, because after a notable encounter with the Dora Milaje, he was returned precisely to where he belonged, back behind bars to continue serving his sentence. The prevailing theory had been that the former Sokovian Baron and decorated villain would emerge as a leading figure within the Thunderbolts, as he has been in the comics, but as the film approached its release, there was still no sign of him in any confirmed capacity, which proved disappointing, particularly since the actor has expressed a genuine eagerness to bring the character back into the MCU fold. Speaking about the prospect of returning in 2024, the actor discussed the possibility of Zemo making a comeback, noting that while he is definitely not completely out of the picture, the character would need to find a way to navigate the murky continuity that now includes several interconnected storylines, including those involving the street-level heroes who made up the Defenders and the various villains reportedly linked to those narratives. One villain who proved particularly troublesome was Diamondback, Eric Stryker, who even after receiving an enhancement that granted him the power to take on Luke Cage in Harlem, ultimately ended up being apprehended and finding himself housed in a facility for imprisoned superpowered individuals. Revealed to be the half-brother of Luke Cage, Diamondback had attempted to frame the Power Man for a series of murders, but his plan ultimately unraveled. Unfortunately, like so many characters introduced in Marvel's Netflix-era shows, there has been no official confirmation on whether Diamondback will return to the broader MCU. Given that his half-brother, a character who has long been associated with a distinctive yellow shirt, has not yet been confirmed for any return either, fans can only wait and wonder whether Diamondback will eventually swing back into the story in some spectacular fashion. Turning now to the events of Avengers: Age of Ultron, which was positively cleaning up at the box office at the time of its release, writer and director Joss Whedon had an extraordinarily difficult task ahead of him in crafting a sequel to the third highest-grossing movie ever made. As it turned out, however, he was facing a challenge far greater than simply following up a massive movie. When you are building on something of that scale, it becomes almost a foregone conclusion that the sequel will need to be even bigger and more expansive. Age of Ultron is jam-packed with story, characters, action sequences, and interconnecting plot lines, so it is entirely understandable that the film's ending might leave some audiences feeling a little hollow or unfulfilled, even as it does the essential work of setting up Marvel's Phase 3 and pointing the way toward an even larger story. Let's break down the very end of the film, and from this point forward, spoilers are abundant. At the conclusion of Age of Ultron, Thor's team of Avengers has somewhat disbanded, and a brand new lineup has assembled in its place. The new team includes Scarlet Witch, War Machine, Falcon, Vision, and Black Widow, with Captain America serving as the official team leader. Notably absent is Tony Stark, who has stepped back to pursue a quieter life with his family, while Thor has departed to investigate a growing threat connected to the Infinity Stones. The Blue Gem, which served as the MacGuffin in the original Avengers film, is known as the Space Stone. The captured Chitauri scepter houses the Yellow Mind Stone, which is subsequently used to give life and consciousness to Vision in Age of Ultron. The Red Gem functions as a powerful artifact in its own right, and assuming the Infinity Stones in the MCU mirror the Infinity Gems from the original comics, the remaining stones yet to be fully accounted for are the Soul Stone, the Time Stone, and the Reality Stone. Based on the convergence of storylines in Age of Ultron, one of the film's most significant, if brief, moments involves a large purple alien figure picking up a gauntlet and placing it over his fist, muttering to himself that if he wants something done properly, he will have to do it himself. This, of course, is the Infinity Gauntlet. In the comics, if any being is able to collect all 6 Infinity Stones and insert them into the gauntlet, they effectively gain the power to reshape reality itself on a universal scale. Thor's storyline in Age of Ultron leads him to the conclusion that it is no coincidence that so many extraordinarily powerful objects have crossed the Avengers' path. Someone, he suspects, is manipulating them like pawns on a chessboard. That someone is Thanos, the immensely powerful cosmic warlord who has apparently grown frustrated with the failures of those he has dispatched to do his bidding and has now decided to take matters directly into his own hands. However, the post-credit scene raises far more questions than it answers. When audiences last saw the Infinity Gauntlet, it was on display in Odin's vault in Asgard. How did Thanos come to possess it? Is he working with Loki or with Odin himself? And what exactly are his immediate intentions? Observant commenters have pointed out a fascinating detail from this scene that was later confirmed: the MCU actually has two Infinity Gauntlets. The one seen in Odin's vault is designed for a right hand, while the gauntlet Thanos reaches for and slips onto his fist in the post-credit scene is distinctly left-handed. This presumably sets up even further reality-bending conflict for Avengers: Infinity War, adding another intriguing layer of mystery to the overarching narrative of the MCU. When Thanos first showed up at the end of the original Avengers film, everyone assumed he would be the primary villain in Avengers 2. However, as Age of Ultron unfolded, it became clear that he was not going to play that role just yet. To be honest, as he was presented in that brief appearance, Thanos came across as somewhat incompetent and not particularly threatening as a villain. There was no doubt that he would receive considerably more character development in Phase 3, but it raised the question of whether introducing him at the end of the first Avengers was a case of Marvel jumping the gun too early. With Avengers: Infinity War confirmed to be a two-part movie event, audiences knew that Thanos would finally be brought to the forefront at that point in time, or at least that was the hope, because if Marvel was planning to hold him back all the way until Phase 4, that would have been a deeply frustrating creative decision. In the meantime, audiences would see parts of his quest unfold during the build-up to the 2018 Infinity War. The question remained whether that film would also need to cover Thanos' backstory and the ongoing quest for all the Infinity Stones, given the sheer number of Marvel films and characters that would need to be incorporated between Age of Ultron and Infinity War. With 6 more Marvel films confirmed to be released in that window, it was difficult to know exactly how many of them would directly contribute to setting up the Infinity War saga, though Doctor Strange seemed the most likely candidate to carry the heaviest amount of build-up given the mystical nature of some of the Infinity Stones. Thanos, meanwhile, appeared to be actively on the hunt. In any event, Age of Ultron served as a satisfying swan song for Joss Whedon as he departed Marvel Studios. He had managed to balance the continued evolution of his central characters while simultaneously delivering a thrilling and action-packed follow-up to the first Avengers and laying the foundations for Phase 3. As evidenced by the film's concluding minutes, the scope of Age of Ultron was enormous, but as audiences followed the clues and looked ahead at where Marvel was heading, it was abundantly clear that things were only going to get bigger and more ambitious from that point forward. Avengers: Age of Ultron is not exactly the most memorable film in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and audiences could be forgiven for forgetting some of the finer plot details of that particular adventure. But many will retain at least a vague memory of Scarlet Witch using her powers to show several of the Avengers' terrifying visions in which Captain America, Iron Man, and Black Widow each experienced something deeply personal and unsettling. In Thor's vision, he encounters Hela, the goddess of death who rules over Hell, a realm whose very name echoes the concept of Hell itself. In the vision, Thor watches helplessly as Asgard falls into chaos, and he ultimately decides to sacrifice his beloved realm to her rather than allow his people to suffer, escaping with them as his world crumbles. So in a sense, Thor does initially destroy his own world in the vision by surrendering it to a being who embodies death and destruction. Steve Rogers, meanwhile, imagines himself transported back in time to the era he came from, finding himself at the end of World War II and dancing with his great love Peggy Carter. In the vision, Peggy reassures him that the war is over and that they can finally go home. At the time, many fans assumed that this vision represented what Steve's subconscious truly longed for, the life he could have lived but never got to experience. And in Avengers: Endgame, Steve does ultimately achieve precisely that. He travels back in time and lives out a quiet and happy life with Peggy, growing old together, and by the end of the film he is seen sitting on a bench, the same way he and Peggy had once danced in the vision, a life fully and beautifully lived. Tony Stark's vision, on the other hand, is far more disturbing in nature. He initially believes he is having a flashback to the Battle of New York from the original Avengers film when he sees the alien army and Loki. But the vision quickly turns darker. He sees Black Widow lying on the ground, broken and defeated, and Captain America's shield shattered in 2 pieces at his feet. The camera pulls back to reveal that the heroes are lying on what appears to be a barren planet or asteroid, scattered and defeated after a catastrophic battle. Tony is left standing among the fallen, and a wounded Steve Rogers wakes briefly and asks Tony why he did not do more to save them. This harrowing vision could very well be interpreted as a dark foreshadowing of the events of Avengers, Infinity War and Endgame, and it is worth noting that Thanos ultimately uses the very same alien army, the Chitauri, originally dispatched under Loki's command, to invade Earth in Endgame, lending the vision an eerie prophetic quality. Black Widow, however, does not see a vision of the future but rather a haunting glimpse of her past. She sees herself in what appears to be a ballet school, but which is in reality a brutal training program for assassins operated by the Russian government. In a deeply ironic way, this vision also speaks to Black Widow's future, because she ultimately sacrifices herself halfway through Avengers Endgame in order to obtain the Soul Stone for the team. Marvel later announced a Black Widow prequel film that would explore her origins as a Russian spy and trained assassin, meaning that the dark past shown in her vision would eventually be given its own dedicated cinematic exploration. Age of Ultron is full of small winks, nods, and Easter eggs for attentive viewers, and it is well worth examining them in greater detail. It is not uncommon for Marvel to shake things up and introduce a new lineup for the Avengers team, much in the same way that comic book rosters tend to shift and evolve with each new story arc. In the world of comics, a new creative team often signals a reshuffling of the team's membership, and a new movie with a new director serves much the same narrative function on screen. It is also worth noting that the films are heavily inspired by the Ultimate Universe comics, which featured its own distinctive and modernized versions of these iconic characters. Thor departs the main team and returns to Asgard in search of answers about the Infinity Stones, hoping to piece together the connection between so many powerful artifacts appearing simultaneously. Captain America and Black Widow remain the anchors of the Avengers following the conclusion of Age of Ultron, which makes sense given their central roles, though the pace at which their stories were expected to unfold was relentless, with Civil War and then Infinity War arriving in rapid succession. If Captain America were to die in Civil War, audiences would lose the chance to see his arc conclude properly, which would have been a significant narrative loss. Tony Stark, having passed on the literal armor-wearing, villain-punching duties before in the comics, appears to be stepping himself in and out of the active roster as the situation demands. This could set the stage for a version of Civil War in which Tony finds himself squaring off against former teammates, a conflict that might be slightly easier to accept emotionally than turning on people he had literally been fighting alongside just days before. Thor departs in search of the cause behind so many powerful artifacts appearing simultaneously, acknowledging that it cannot be mere coincidence. Importantly, he does not yet know about the Guardians of the Galaxy and the Infinity Stone they encountered, which means the scope of the conspiracy is even larger than he realizes. The logical first step in his investigation would be to seek out Loki and find out who gave him the Mind Stone-powered scepter in the first place. Bruce Banner, meanwhile, chooses to go dark by spending his final moments in the film talking with his complicated love interest before disappearing off the grid, presumably vanishing into the ocean somewhere aboard a Quinjet. The chances of a Hulk and Black Widow romance subplot continuing seemed slim, but hope springs eternal. The idea is clearly that while Bruce Banner would rather disappear than endanger Natasha and everyone around him, he knows that without her he has been handed a perfect opportunity to step away and protect others from himself. He will almost certainly take that opportunity and likely resurface during Infinity War when the world truly needs the Hulk once again. The question of whether this might mark the beginning of Tony Stark pulling together a new list of allies is an interesting one. The fact that Bruce appears to have exited the scene in Age of Ultron, and yet is confirmed to appear in Captain America: Civil War, raises further questions about how complete his departure from the team really is. It would seem like an odd creative choice to give him such a thorough and emotionally satisfying character arc and then simply reset everything within a year's time. The post-credit sequence showing Thanos grabbing the Infinity Gauntlet, clearly right-hand in design, unlike the left-handed version seen in Odin's vault, confirms that the broader mystery of the stones is still very much in play. By the events of Age of Ultron, audiences have already seen 4 of the 6 Infinity Stones come into play within the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The Power Stone appeared in Guardians of the Galaxy, the Space Stone was the central MacGuffin in the original Avengers, the Mind Stone was embedded in Loki's scepter and subsequently used to give Vision life and consciousness, and the Reality Stone appeared in Thor: The Dark World. The stone formerly housed in Loki's scepter is now embedded in Vision's forehead, which creates an obvious and deeply troubling conflict of interest heading into Infinity War. The conclusion of Infinity War Part 1, and the new Avengers roster assembled at the end of Age of Ultron, seemed destined to require the old guard to eventually return as reinforcements. By the end of the film, the mighty heroes have defeated Ultron, but not without tremendous cost. After all, it was the Avengers themselves who created the danger in the first place, and all of the death and destruction that resulted from Ultron's rampage was a direct consequence of their own hubris. That burden weighs heavily on the team as they move forward. As for what comes next, the heroes are embarking on new individual journeys while the Avengers simultaneously take on a new form, a new objective, a new base of operations, and a new sense of shared purpose. Where does that leave the original Avengers initiative going forward, and for the heroes who remain devoted to the team? What exactly comes next for each of them? Pietro Maximoff, known as Quicksilver, dies a hero in the final battle against Ultron in Sokovia, and his sacrifice becomes the turning point of the entire confrontation. His death solidifies his twin sister Wanda's role as a full-fledged member of the Avengers, transforming Scarlet Witch from a reluctant and conflicted figure into someone wholly committed to the team's mission. Alongside her stands Vision, the newly created synthesoid powered by the Mind Stone, who believes deeply in protecting life at all costs. While these 2 new additions would seemingly expand the team's roster considerably, both of the original 6 core Avengers go their separate ways by the end of the film. Tony Stark steps back from his role as the Armored Avenger following the psychological and moral fallout of the Ultron incident. Bruce Banner vanishes into self-imposed exile. Thor returns to Asgard. Clint Barton, having revealed in Age of Ultron that he has a family living in peaceful secrecy, returns to them, bringing the story back to the intimate human core that makes the character so compelling. The 2 remaining spots in the core lineup are filled by proven and trusted allies, Sam Wilson, known as the Falcon, and James Rhodes, known as War Machine. The new Avengers roster following the events of Age of Ultron therefore stands as follows: Captain America, Black Widow, Falcon, War Machine, Scarlet Witch, and Vision. Each new member fills a role left vacant by a departing original. Vision essentially steps into a space left by Iron Man. Falcon steps up as a new aerial combatant in a role comparable to Hawkeye. And Scarlet Witch, with her reality-altering and telekinetic abilities, brings a completely different but equally formidable power set that elevates the team's overall capability significantly, replacing the raw physical power of Thor and the Hulk with something far more unpredictable and potentially unlimited. It is a very different roster, but one that maintains a similar balance between the grounded and the extraordinary, while also representing a meaningful boost in the team's overall diversity. However, this particular combination of 6 heroes will not last very long. The majority of the characters introduced across the Marvel Cinematic Universe will have some role to play in Captain America: Civil War, and there is always the possibility that 1 or 2 new characters might join the team following the events of Ant-Man, the final Marvel release of Phase 2. By the time Avengers: Infinity War arrives in 2018 and 2019, audiences can expect to see virtually every living hero who has been introduced throughout the MCU making some kind of appearance across the 2-part event. Exactly who funded the new Avengers facility in upstate New York and who continues to oversee the team's operations remained unclear at the time, but according to Joss Whedon, the events of the film take place just a few months after the Battle of Sokovia, enough time for a new base to have been established and for the team to begin its next chapter. With the new Avengers base established and the team reforming under fresh leadership, life was beginning to settle into a new rhythm. Enough time had passed since the Battle of Sokovia for a new base to be built and for Clint Barton's child to be born. The story was still somewhat connected to the broader picture, with the television series on ABC continuing the narrative thread after Nick Fury and Maria Hill made their daring escape from the helicarrier over Sokovia. One can only assume that the new Avengers facility introduced at the end of the film serves as a convenient location where the Hulk can be summoned and brought back into the fold whenever he is needed. If Banner is not part of Civil War, and indeed he was not in the comics, because at that point in the source material he was on another planet entirely, then Marvel may be deliberately holding him back and saving his return for Avengers: Infinity War. This would allow the studio to preserve the remaining portions of Mark Ruffalo's contract for Phase 4, using his appearances strategically rather than burning through them too quickly. Tony Stark's wide variety of armored suits may not be immune to harm. In fact, most if not all of them have been destroyed at one point or another throughout the Marvel and Marvel Television storylines, but Stark himself seems remarkably resilient and difficult to keep down. A great deal of the deception and manipulation carried out by Ultron was essentially a direct reaction to Tony's own hubris and recklessness. Could that be part of the reason he seemed so ready to step back by the end of the film? The Avengers have been re-established and, at least on the surface, no longer appear to need Iron Man or his financial resources to function. But knowing Tony Stark and his deeply ingrained and almost pathological fear of a future alien invasion he cannot stop, it seems abundantly clear that he is not going to retreat into a peaceful family life the way Clint Barton has done. Despite his jokes at Captain America's expense, Stark is absolutely going to continue working on something, some new technology, some new system of protection, that he believes can prevent an even larger and more devastating alien invasion from succeeding. He may pursue this work outside of the official Avengers framework, or at least outside of whatever version of it Nick Fury might sanction. After all, that fear of an unstoppable invasion is precisely what his Scarlet Witch-induced vision was about, and it was that same terror that drove him to create Ultron in the first place. With that story arc clearly building toward something and all of its narrative threads pointing directly at Civil War, it is easy to see how Stark will be pulled back into the fold once again the following year, finding himself at odds with Steve Rogers in Captain America: Civil War. The question that Age of Ultron subtly raises about Civil War is this: what MCU event will serve as the specific trigger that sparks that conflict? The events of Age of Ultron certainly lay the emotional and philosophical groundwork for it, but the precise catalyst has yet to be revealed. As for Clint Barton, his secret family storyline was a revelation for audiences. Throughout the entire run of the MCU up to that point, Hawkeye had a wife and children, and not a single viewer had any idea. This family storyline was lifted directly from the Ultimate Comics version of the Avengers and serves as an incredibly smart plot device to explain his absence during the various large-scale events of Phase 2 without requiring convoluted in-universe explanations. In a similar fashion to Iron Man, the Hulk can conveniently be brought back into the story whenever he is needed without demanding too much of Jeremy Renner's already busy acting schedule. Of course, if the MCU is drawing from the Ultimate Comics version of Hawkeye's story, that could mean his family may eventually be placed in serious danger, and it could mean that audiences are going to see a very different and much darker side of the character than they have ever witnessed before. Jeremy Renner himself said while promoting Age of Ultron that the version of Hawkeye audiences meet in this film is a little closer to the one he was originally promised when he first signed on to the franchise, but that there may be even more secrets and surprising revelations still to come for the character. He spoke about having discussed certain stories and character secrets with the filmmakers that simply could not be implemented in the first film because there was no room for them. Even the backstory elements and secrets that were eventually incorporated into Age of Ultron were not quite the same ones originally discussed. Renner was careful to note that he still could not talk about the remaining secrets because they could still very much happen, and that they were, if anything, even more exciting now than they had been when first conceived. With all of that in mind, audiences were encouraged to share their thoughts on the state of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, how Age of Ultron concluded, and what they wanted to see next. The discussion extended to the film's mid-credits sequence, which, much like the mid-credits scene from the original Avengers, features Thanos, Marvel's ultimate cosmic villain, stepping forward. With all of that in mind, audiences were encouraged to share their thoughts on the state of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, how Age of Ultron concluded, and what they wanted to see next. The discussion extended to the film's mid-credits sequence, which, much like the mid-credits scene from the original Avengers, features Thanos, Marvel's ultimate cosmic villain, stepping forward and declaring that if he wants something done properly, he will simply have to do it himself. Avengers: Age of Ultron stars Robert Downey Jr. returning as Iron Man, Chris Evans as Captain America, Mark Ruffalo as the Hulk, Scarlett Johansson as Black Widow, and Jeremy Renner as Hawkeye, with the additional assembled team coming together once again to defeat James Spader as Ultron, a terrifying technological villain with an obsession with human extinction. Along the way, the team confronts mysterious and powerful newcomers in the form of Wanda Maximoff, the Scarlet Witch, played by Elizabeth Olsen, and Pietro Maximoff, known as Quicksilver, played by Aaron Taylor Johnson. They also encounter an old friend turn something far more extraordinary when Paul Bettany's Jarvis becomes Vision. The film was followed in the Marvel release schedule by Ant-Man in July 2015. After recovering Loki's scepter and the Mind Stone housed within it, Tony Stark and Bruce Banner realize they can use it to create an artificial intelligence for their Ultron peacekeeping program. At its core, Avengers: Age of Ultron has all of the essential elements that made the first Avengers film so thrilling and so much fun. Not only does it deliver large-scale action and explosive set pieces of every conceivable kind, but it also features sharp and sparkling dialogue full of immediate wit and genuine character chemistry. The film's ending is full of small winks and nods to the audience, Easter eggs drawn from the comics and subtle hints at what is still to come in the broader Marvel Cinematic Universe. It is not uncommon for the Avengers to shake up their team roster, and in the world of comics, a new lineup used to be enough to generate significant press coverage and outsized public attention. Nowadays, roster changes happen far more frequently and with less fanfare, and a new film with a new creative direction serves much the same purpose that a new creative team once did on the printed page. It is also worth noting that many of the cinematic choices made in these films are heavily inspired by the Ultimate Universe comics, which reimagined the classic characters in a contemporary and grounded setting. In that Ultimate Universe, the Falcon is shown working for Kang the Conqueror in hopes of assembling the Infinity Stones, which raises fascinating possibilities for where Sam Wilson's story might eventually lead on screen. Captain America and Black Widow remain the backbone of the Avengers going forward, which is a great creative decision, though the pace at which their individual storylines were expected to develop was extraordinarily demanding, with Civil War and Infinity War arriving in rapid succession one after another. The concern was that if Captain America were to die in Civil War, audiences would lose the chance to see his story reach a truly satisfying conclusion, which would represent a significant dramatic loss for the entire franchise. Tony Stark, having symbolically passed on the literal armor-wearing duties in the comics on previous occasions, appeared to be stepping himself in and out of the active Avengers roster as the situation demanded. This creative flexibility could set the stage for a film version of Civil War in which Tony finds himself opposing former teammates and allies, a conflict that might be slightly more emotionally palatable than the idea of him turning against people he had been fighting alongside literally the day before. Thor, meanwhile, departs in search of the cause behind so many extraordinarily powerful artifacts appearing simultaneously across the universe. He is convinced it cannot be a coincidence that so many Infinity Stones have surfaced in such a short space of time, and he is absolutely right. Crucially, as far as anyone in the main Avengers team is aware, Thor does not yet know about the Power Stone encountered by the Guardians of the Galaxy, meaning the full scope of Thanos' machinations is even larger than he currently understands. The first logical step in Thor's investigation would be to track down Loki and demand to know who originally gave him the Mind Stone-powered scepter, and audiences can expect to see a great deal of Loki in the next Thor film as a result. Bruce Banner, the gamma-powered other half of the Hulk, decided to go completely off the grid, spending his final moments in the film having a quietly heartbreaking conversation with Natasha before disappearing off the Quinjet's radar and presumably vanishing into the ocean somewhere. The odds of a full Hulk and Black Widow romantic crossover continuing in any meaningful way were admittedly close to zero, but one could always hope. The underlying idea is clearly that while Banner would in many ways prefer to remain close to Natasha, he is fully aware that he poses a serious danger to everyone around him, and without her steadying influence he has been handed the perfect opportunity to disappear and protect the world from himself. He will almost certainly take that opportunity, lying low and staying out of sight, and then very likely resurface at precisely the moment when the world needs the Hulk most desperately, which would be during Avengers: Infinity War. The question of whether Banner's apparent retirement from the team might mark the beginning of Tony assembling a new and different network of allies is a genuinely intriguing one. The fact that he seemingly steps away from active duty in Age of Ultron, and yet is confirmed to appear in Captain America: Civil War, naturally begs the question of what draws him back. It would seem like a strange creative choice to give Bruce such a complete and emotionally resonant character arc and a satisfying conclusion only to immediately reset everything within a single year. But that is essentially the nature of a shared cinematic universe, multiple writers and directors each putting their own stamp on characters in ways that occasionally contradict or complicate what came before. The post-credits sequence showing Thanos grabbing the Infinity Gauntlet, left-handed, it should be noted, distinct from the right-hand version seen in Odin's vault, confirms that the broader cosmic storyline is firmly in motion. By this point in the MCU, audiences have already seen 4 of the 6 Infinity Stones come into play. The Power Stone appeared in Guardians of the Galaxy, the Space Stone served as the central MacGuffin in the original Avengers, the Mind Stone was embedded in Loki's scepter and then subsequently used to create Vision, and the Reality Stone featured in Thor: The Dark World. The stone formerly housed in Loki's scepter is now permanently embedded in Vision's forehead, creating an obvious and deeply troubling conflict heading into Infinity War, because Thanos will need that stone, and he will not hesitate to take it. Avengers: Age of Ultron concludes on a genuinely fascinating note, one that moves its heroes into new places and new directions while simultaneously laying the essential groundwork for the next phase of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. By the end of the film, the mighty heroes have defeated Ultron and in doing so have brought several new superpowered beings into existence along the way, though not without tremendous cost. After all, it was the Avengers themselves who created the danger this time around, and all of the death and destruction that resulted from Ultron's rampage is ultimately on their conscience. As for what comes next, the heroes are embarking on new individual journeys while the Avengers simultaneously take on a new form, with a new objective, a new roster, and a new base of operations. Where does all of that leave the Avengers Initiative and the legacy of SHIELD going forward? And for the heroes who have left the team, what exactly comes next? To answer those questions, it helps to look carefully at what is known heading into the final chapter of Phase 2. Quicksilver dies a hero in the final battle against Ultron in Sokovia, and his sacrifice becomes the emotional turning point of the entire confrontation, solidifying his twin sister Wanda's role as a full-fledged member of the Avengers. Alongside her stands Vision, powered by the Mind Stone, who believes absolutely in protecting life at all costs. While these new additions seemingly bring the core roster up to a new high, 4 of the original 6 main heroes part ways with the team by the end of the film. Tony Stark steps back from being the team's armored Avenger in the wake of the Ultron incident. Clint Barton returns to his family ranch. Thor departs for Asgard. Bruce Banner vanishes. That brings the team back down to 4, with the remaining 2 spots filled by proven allies Sam Wilson and James Rhodes. The new Avengers lineup following the Age of Ultron therefore stands as Captain America, Black Widow, Falcon, War Machine, Scarlet Witch, and Vision. Recently, there has been something of a cultural panic in certain corners of the entertainment press about the sheer volume of superhero movies scheduled for release in the years ahead. The list includes Ant-Man, Captain America, Civil War, Doctor Strange, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, Spider-Man, Thor: Ragnarok, Avengers, Infinity War Part 1, Black Panther, Captain Marvel, Avengers, Infinity War Part 2, Batman v Superman, and many more besides. The concern is that audiences will eventually grow fatigued by the relentless pace of superhero releases. But this concern is not really any more valid than worrying about the volume of romantic comedies or horror films released in any given year. The superhero genre is clearly stimulating the broader film industry in remarkable ways, and there is certainly nothing inherently wrong with films that are exuberant, funny, silly, crazy, and exhilarating all at the same time. In that spirit, Age of Ultron, once again written and directed by Joss Whedon, brings the Avengers back together under the dual leadership of Captain America and the possibly duplicitous guidance of Tony Stark as Iron Man, played with Robert Downey Jr.'s trademark single eyebrow delivery and perfectly calibrated throwaway wit. It is a role that has by this point arguably come to define his entire career and legacy as an actor. Where previous films assembled the Avengers in a way that felt like a traveling circus or a birth of superheroism, Age of Ultron feels more structured and deliberate, more like a G7 summit of the world's most powerful individuals, each carrying the weight of their own complicated histories and competing agendas, all trying to find common ground before the universe forces their hand once and for all. The world of the Avengers is one built on saving lives and fighting crime, with every constitutional member of the team becoming something of an angel of capability and a general of lethality. But more importantly, Tony Stark began to experiment, without the knowledge of his comrades, with an artificial intelligence program that he believed could impose absolute and total protection on Earth, supposedly designed to repel all enemies and threats before they could do harm. This megalomaniacal superbrain, resembling in its early form a floating blue jellyfish of pure energy and consciousness, instantly went rogue and became a terrifying and dangerous new enemy named Ultron. Appropriating a new exoskeleton, an army of robotic drones, and an increasingly sophisticated physical form, Ultron rapidly evolved into a twisted mirror image of his effective creator. Using the blindly absurd phrase, "peace in our time," to describe his plan for humanity's salvation through total annihilation, Ultron's logic is entirely and operatically mad. The city-destroying final confrontation that results is beginning to feel somewhat familiar as a genre convention, but the film carries it off with such genuine joy, inventiveness, and even a kind of evangelical enthusiasm for its own ideas that it remains thoroughly entertaining throughout. Vision in particular is a creeping wonder, a being of immense power and quiet dignity who delivers some of the film's greatest lines with measured and otherworldly calm. His remark that he has had a long day, delivered with complete sincerity amid the chaos of battle, is one of the film's most memorable moments. The unresolved romantic and sexual tension between Black Widow and Bruce Banner creates a warm and genuinely moving emotional undercurrent that drives much of the film's quieter character work. Even the moments of pure absurdity are somehow woven into the film's internal logic and tonal consistency, never allowed to overwhelm or undermine the more serious dramatic stakes. Andy Serkis appears memorably as Ulysses Klaue. Black Widow's sinister former controller adds another layer of menace to her complicated backstory, and the whole enterprise crackles with superheroic energy and fun throughout. At this point in the broader discussion, it is worth stepping back and acknowledging something entirely separate from the world of Marvel and comic book movies. In 1936, John Scott, owner of the legendary newspaper and celebrated editor C.P. Scott, did something almost unheard of in the world of media. He gave up his personal stake in the publication for the greater good after inheriting the newspaper. Scott surrendered all financial benefit but kept the Guardian alive and passed ownership over to a newly formed trust. That trust would evolve over the decades to carry a clear and unwavering commission, to secure the financial and editorial independence of the Guardian in perpetuity. What that means in practical terms is that the Guardian cannot be bought by private equity firms, cannot be absorbed by a conglomerate, and most definitely cannot be acquired by a billionaire looking for a political mouthpiece or a platform to serve their own interests. With that history in mind, there are three compelling reasons to consider supporting the Guardian. First, quality investigative journalism matters most precisely at the moments when the powerful are getting away with the most, and this is one of those moments. Second, the Guardian is genuinely independent and has no billionaire owner controlling what it reports, how it reports it, or which stories it chooses to pursue. Third, reader support directly powers the journalism itself. It does not cost much and takes less time than it does to actually read one of the articles being funded. This unique ownership model also means that the Guardian depends on readers from all over the world, including from Pakistan, to help fund its work. That independence means the publication can say what it wants, report on whoever it wants, challenge whoever it wants, and continue standing up at a time when many other outlets are sitting down. If you believe that the journalism you read should be the result of editorial decisions made by journalists and editors rather than by shareholders or ultra-wealthy proprietors, then you already know what to do. Returning now to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Avengers: Age of Ultron was a major moment for the studio, arriving at a time when Marvel felt almost entirely untouchable and invincible. Just 3 years earlier, the box office phenomenon that was the original Avengers had redefined what blockbuster filmmaking could look like and made more than $1.5 billion worldwide. The eyes of the entire entertainment industry were on director Joss Whedon's follow-up, and while Age of Ultron was also hugely successful on paper, it ultimately taught Marvel a crucial and lasting lesson about the nature of creative ambition and the dangers of overreach. In the book detailing the story of Marvel Studios and the making of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it is explained that the critical reception to Age of Ultron was markedly less enthusiastic than the reaction to the original Avengers. Many viewers have come to regard Age of Ultron as one of Marvel's most underrated films, but it is impossible to deny that the response to it at the time was far more mixed. It is a more belated and more layered film with a great deal on its mind, yet it struggled to live up to its own extraordinarily high standards while simultaneously trying to service a vast number of different MCU storylines and character threads. The experience of making Age of Ultron effectively pushed Whedon away from making any more Marvel movies, in no small part because the production had been so exhausting and creatively compromising. He later compared the experience to emerging from something akin to a kind of combat. In his own words, he acknowledged that there are parts of the film where he feels things could have been better, but equally there are parts where he believes everything landed exactly where it needed to be. He spoke about looking at moments of conflict within the film and finding them genuinely difficult to process, and then watching the movie and feeling that everything he had been trying to say was right there on screen. Avengers: Age of Ultron ultimately made more than $1.5 billion at the global box office, but it genuinely felt as though Marvel had just barely gotten away with it creatively. The book explains that in the aftermath, Marvel subsequently placed a much stronger emphasis on ensuring that every sequel had a rock-solid and clearly articulated reason to exist. In more recent years, Marvel has visibly struggled to live up to that standard with several of its sequels. The Marvels finished its theatrical run as the lowest-grossing MCU film ever made. Captain America: Brave New World stumbled significantly at the box office in 2025. But on paper, at least, there is a justifiable creative reason for almost every Marvel sequel to have been made since Age of Ultron, regardless of how those films performed commercially or how they were received critically. Avengers, Infinity War and Endgame absolutely have a clear and powerful reason to exist. It is easy to understand why Sam Wilson deserved his own solo Captain America movie, which forms the narrative justification for Brave New World. The Guardians of the Galaxy sequels carry genuine and deeply felt emotional weight. Black Panther: Wakanda Forever was a sincere and moving tribute to the legacy of the late Chadwick Boseman. Looking back, Age of Ultron stands as a clear before and after demarcation point for the studio, a pivotal moment that changed how Marvel thought about the creative obligations of a sequel. The year 2004 proved to be a genuinely special one for the comic book movie genre. It was the year in which two of the greatest superhero films ever made were released, Spider-Man 2 and The Incredibles, and it was also the year in which Warner Brothers approached comedian Robert Smigel to write a Green Lantern film. That would have starred Jack Black. As soon as word spread online, fans made absolutely sure that Warner Brothers knew exactly what they thought of the idea, politely naturally. It appears that the torrent of online outrage actually served a constructive purpose in this instance, helping to stop what would have been a deeply questionable creative decision from moving forward. Written as a broad comedy, the story would have seen the Green Lantern ring malfunction and mistakenly find its way to a completely out-of-his-depth reality television star rather than the rightful bearer Hal Jordan. The hapless new ring bearer would have fumbled his way through his unexpected superhero responsibilities before ultimately discovering a genuine hero somewhere inside himself. When described in those terms, the premise does sound more than a little like a live-action Kung Fu Panda with a Green Lantern ring substituted in place of Po the Panda. It is difficult to determine with any certainty how such a film would ultimately have fared at the box office, but had the Green Lantern element been stripped away entirely, it might conceivably have been an entertaining enough vehicle for Jack Black to work within its own right. By comparison, in 2007 Dwayne Johnson was cast as Black Adam and was set to appear in a Shazam movie as well. That project subsequently went through so many different iterations, creative overhauls, studio changes, and periods of total stagnation that by the time Black Adam was finally released in 2022, the wait had been so extraordinarily long that it felt as though entire lifetimes had passed in between: grandfather graduating, families starting, children being born, and eventually, decades later, a film arriving that was supposed to change the hierarchy of power. As the jokes about the weight began to wear a little thin, it became clear that Johnson's role as Black Adam had struggled to find the traction and cultural weight the studio had hoped for. While Black Adam was still mired in development, Johnson was offered another superhero role in 2012. The actor confirmed in online posts that rumors of him possibly playing Lobo were true, and that writer Brad Peyton was working on it at the time. It was noted that such a collaboration could be genuinely fun, since Johnson and Peyton had worked together on several projects including Journey 2, The Mysterious Island, San Andreas, and Rampage. However, Johnson would ultimately depart the Lobo project by 2013. It is not difficult to see how someone could imagine Johnson in the role of Lobo, the intergalactic mercenary and main man. He is physically imposing, genuinely charismatic, and would probably cut quite an impressive figure sitting astride a space motorcycle while wearing a black wig. In a world where Johnson and his frequent collaborator Jeffrey Dean Morgan both exist as larger-than-life screen presences, it raises the question of whether anyone was truly asking for a Johnson-led Lobo film, and whether that was really what DC needed while trying to construct a coherent shared universe of its own. Before Robert Downey Jr. suited up as Iron Man and kick-started the most successful shared cinematic universe in film history, there were earlier and very different plans for an Iron Man movie. After working on the smash hit Spider-Man 2, writers Alfred Gough and Miles Miller were approached by producers Avi Arad and Kevin Feige about writing a script for Iron Man. In 2005, Tom Cruise confirmed to IGN that he had been approached to play Iron Man but had ultimately walked away from the project. He explained his reasoning with characteristic precision: when he commits to something, he wants to do it right, and if he is going to commit to a role, it has to be done in a way that he knows will result in something truly special. As the project was lining up at the time, it simply did not feel to him like it was going to reach that standard. An Iron Man film written by Gough and Miller and starring Tom Cruise does not sound like the worst idea in the world by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, it is worth pausing to consider that had that version of the film actually gone into full development, the Tony Stark that audiences came to know and love through Robert Downey Jr. would never have existed. Team Downey, all day and every day. Have you ever glanced at the price of a gas station sandwich and thought it was impressively inexpensive? Well, Cannon Films somehow managed to make an entire movie for less than that at one point during the 1980s. At one point, Cannon Films' Spider-Man nearly transformed into something truly extraordinary for all the wrong reasons, after Menahem Golan and Yoram Globus acquired the film rights to Spider-Man for $225,000 as part of a broader deal, as reported by the Los Angeles Times. According to filmmaker Joseph Zito, who was hired to direct the Cannon Films' Spider-Man, Golan and Globus were genuinely not well versed in the source material. In fact, they thought Spider-Man was essentially akin to Wolfman, which led them to bring in the creator of The Outer Limits to write a story in which Peter Parker would actually transform into a monstrous eight-legged lizard spider creature, because, apparently, why not push that creative boundary as far as it will go? Cannon started over on the film multiple times as it underwent a bewildering series of creative reinventions and writer changes. While the Cannon film Spider-Man never made it to the screen, a teaser trailer was actually created for it and can be viewed on YouTube to this day. One viewing makes abundantly clear that children in homemade Halloween costumes regularly achieve better production values than what appears in that trailer. This would have been about as cheaply made a film as was humanly possible, because Cannon Films operated on the motto that with great power comes a smaller budget. The spider monster idea that Cannon had developed eventually became canonized in a different form in the actual Spider-Man comics, where a version of the concept appeared as a storyline. It does not tell you everything you need to know about the Daredevil film that followed years later, but the broader pattern is clear. Daredevil is not the worst superhero film ever made, not by a long stretch, but it is a textbook example of what a Hollywood studio thinks a comic book movie should look like after skimming a Wikipedia article about the character and then attempting to reverse engineer the result to appeal to every possible demographic simultaneously. Not a single soul asked for the Elektra movie that arrived 2 years after Daredevil, but things could have been even worse. Consider the Daredevil joke. Despite receiving overwhelmingly negative reviews, Daredevil actually knocked it out of the park financially, making $179 million from a $78 million budget. So a sequel was always under serious consideration. In 2003, writer and director Mark Steven Johnson told a publication that discussions had taken place about possibly adapting Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli's Born Again storyline, or alternatively Kevin Smith's celebrated Guardian Devil arc, for a Daredevil 2. By 2004, Ben Affleck shared a similar sentiment, saying he would reconsider putting on the costume again if the material was darker and more mature in its approach. In retrospect, walking away was the wise decision. Despite both Johnson and Affleck pushing for a more mature and tonally darker sequel, it was highly unlikely to have been greenlit in that form at that particular moment in film history. This was the era before The Dark Knight fundamentally changed everything about how studios perceived and developed comic book movies. In all likelihood, 20th Century Fox would simply have wanted more of the same crowd-pleasing formula, packed with even more villain appearances and needle-drop pop songs on the soundtrack. If you are looking for the cinematic equivalent of throwing absolutely everything at the wall to see what manages to stick, look no further than Sony's Spider-Man universe. Inspired by the runaway success of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Sony attempted to recreate a similar shared universe experience using its own extensive catalog of Spider-Man-related characters. There was, of course, one fundamental and insurmountable problem with this plan: most of those characters are simply not interesting or well-known enough to sustain their own solo films. Regardless of that rather significant obstacle, as the MCU continued to power from billion-dollar hit to billion-dollar hit with seemingly effortless consistency, Sony decided to go full steam ahead with its own expanded universe plan. At one point, the studio hired the talented filmmaker Gina Prince-Bythewood to write and direct Silver and Black, which would have been a team-up movie featuring Silver Sable and Black Cat. By 2018, however, Sony had decided to scrap Silver and Black entirely in favor of producing standalone films for each character separately. Judging by the eventual results of Morbius, Madam Web, and Kraven the Hunter, there is very little doubt that Silver and Black would have ended up as another corporate, muddled, and tonally confused affair. Prince-Bythewood undoubtedly understood how to handle superhero material. One only has to look at what she accomplished with the old guard to appreciate her capabilities, but it would have been an uphill battle to execute her vision within Sony's Spider-Man universe, which seemed constitutionally incapable of getting out of its own way. When thinking about Marvel's mutants and which name comes to mind first, the obvious answers are Wolverine, Professor X, Jean Grey, Storm, or perhaps Gambit. One name that would definitely not appear in anyone's top 10 or even top 20 is Jamie Madrox, otherwise known as Multiple Man. He is a character whose primary power is the ability to duplicate himself, which is undeniably useful but hardly the kind of thing that sets box office records. Nevertheless, in 2017 news broke that writer Alan Heinberg was writing a script for a Multiple Man movie in which James Franco would both produce and star. It was all part of 20th Century Fox's broader plan to expand the X-Men universe at a time when Deadpool had practically printed money for the studio. The executives likely gathered in a room, threw a board full of mutant names at the wall, and Multiple Man somehow ended up next on the development list. Two events ultimately prevented the project from moving forward: Disney's acquisition of Fox, and the serious public allegations made against Franco that emerged a year later. All in all, no one genuinely missed out on anything here, except perhaps the small and dedicated handful of Multiple Man fans who had been quietly holding out hope for a movie about their beloved if somewhat obscure favorite character. Not every comic book character needs or deserves their own film or television show, and that is a lesson that several studios and networks have been learning the hard way in recent years. As it turns out, 20th Century Fox had also been planning to do something with the Canadian superhero team Alpha Flight back in 2017. Producer Simon Kinberg spoke to comicbook.com about some of the plans in the works at the time, explaining that the studio had a clear sense of where each of their existing characters was headed, from Deadpool to the New Mutants to the mainline X-Men films to potentially even an X-23 standalone project. Kinberg then mentioned other characters he was thinking about developing, including Exiles and what he referred to as the X-Flight, which is, of course, Alpha Flight. Now, everyone makes mistakes, and it is entirely possible that the group's correct name simply slipped Kinberg's mind in that particular moment of the interview. But the fact that Alpha Flight is so thoroughly unmemorable that even the producer overseeing their potential development could not quite remember what they were called says absolutely everything there is to say about the likelihood of that project ever capturing the public imagination. To put it plainly, trying to make Alpha Flight happen would have been a deeply misguided ambition, and the franchise was better off without it. Prior to Christopher Nolan taking over the Batman franchise in the mid-2000s and delivering his landmark Dark Knight trilogy, director Darren Aronofsky had presented his own bold and singular vision for a dark Batman film to the studio. The filmmaker wanted to adapt the celebrated comic book storyline Batman, Year One by Frank Miller, and he even enlisted Miller himself to collaborate on the script. The result would reportedly have been even darker and more uncompromising than the already gritty and morally complex source material. On the surface, this sounds genuinely thrilling. So how does it end up on the list of cancelled comic book movies that audiences are arguably glad were never made? The answer lies in the fundamental disconnect between what the director and what the studio each wanted from the project that A.S. Aronofsky recalled in an interview with Empire magazine in 2020. He remembered clearly thinking that he and the studio were effectively making two completely different films that had nothing to do with each other. Effectively, what made the whole situation even more alarming to consider in hindsight is this: the studio had been pushing for Ashton Kutcher to be cast as the next Batman, following the catastrophic failure of the George Clooney experiment in Batman and Robin. And it could realistically have happened had someone at Warner Brothers pushed hard enough for it. No disrespect to Ashton Kutcher, who is a perfectly capable and charming performer, but nothing about him remotely screams Dark Knight, nor is he the casting choice that anyone was clamoring for at the time. The whole situation looks, in retrospect, like yet another instance of Warner Brothers trying to force a square peg into a round hole, chasing a marketable and commercially appealing star rather than the right one for the material. When Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3 hit cinemas in 1993, it was abundantly and painfully clear that turtle power had curdled into something far less appetizing. The film performed poorly on virtually every level, and yet the franchise still required one more cinematic push before it could be allowed to rest. A fourth Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle film was at one point officially greenlit and moved into active development. Several drafts of the screenplay were written, including a version by Christina Ford and Roger Schulman, and another entirely separate draft by Greg Sefiro and John Travis. Not a great deal is publicly known about the unproduced fourth film beyond some concept art that has since surfaced. While a few of those design ideas hint at genuinely interesting story potential, there is no question that the franchise had painted itself into a creative corner so tight that no amount of new character designs or villain concepts could have rescued it without a full and comprehensive reboot from the ground up. Before the announcement that James Gunn and Peter Safran would be heading up an entirely new era of DC at Warner Brothers, the DC Cinematic Universe stood in a state of total and bewildering confusion. Everything seemed to be happening in a completely disorganized and willy-nilly fashion, with no one, including apparently those running the studio, entirely sure of what fit where, how the various announced projects connected to each other, or what the broader creative vision actually was. One of the stranger films announced during the chaotic period in 2022 was a project said to be a Ghost Rider film heading to HBO Maximum. Could an unwanted film like that have worked in the right hands? Absolutely, but not when embedded within a previous DC plan that had no coherent structure holding it together. Everyone with eyes could see that the DC universe desperately needed a trustworthy and authoritative course correction. If any further proof were needed of just how chaotic things had become, one only had to consider the way certain films were lit up with excitement in April 2022 and then cancelled entirely just a month later. That tells you everything you need to know about the state of affairs at the time. One hand did not even know if the other was connected to the same body. Which brings us to one of the most prominent entries on the list of cancelled comic book movies that audiences are genuinely glad were never made: Green Lantern 2. Yes, a direct sequel to the disastrous 2011 film. Lest anyone forget, the original Green Lantern was supposed to be a cornerstone and launchpad for the entire DC extended universe, but the box office disappointment it delivered, coupled with its universally savage critical reviews, left Warner Brothers doing some very uncomfortable thinking. The film had made money regardless, which in purely financial terms made a sequel seem like a defensible proposition, irrespective of how many fundamental things in Green Lantern made absolutely no creative sense. Had that sequel been made, audiences would have been subjected to yet more of Ryan Reynolds' Hal Jordan stumbling around in a computer-generated green suit, and the results would almost certainly have been even more confused and unsatisfying than the first film. Funnily enough, Warner Brothers seemed determined to push ahead regardless of how clearly the original Green Lantern had demonstrated its limitations. Considering how weak the foundational storytelling of the first film was, bringing back the same writers for a follow-up was unlikely to have improved anything in any meaningful way. The iteration of the Emerald Knight that audiences got in 2011 simply did not work on any of the levels it needed to, and it was always going to be far better to move on entirely rather than continue patching over the enormous and gaping holes where a coherent storyline and compelling character development should have been. Stepping away from cancelled projects and turning back to the world of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, aside from the villains who have been dramatically snapped out of existence or met with some other spectacular and final fate, some of the MCU's most dangerous and menacing figures have simply ended up finding themselves behind bars, locked away in order to keep them in check. These threats to society and to the superheroes who protect it have been sent to the Raft, a super maximum security prison planted squarely in the middle of the ocean, not unlike Rikers Island in concept. The Raft was first introduced in Captain America: Civil War, when those who opposed the Sokovia Accords were bagged, tagged, and dragged into this heavily fortified facility, with no way out unless someone with the appropriate authority gave the order. The MCU is a big and ever-expanding place, and following the events of Captain America: Brave New World, the Raft is only getting more crowded, filled with everything from failed politicians to financial war criminals to gamma-powered monsters. The Raft has accumulated a genuinely fascinating guest list of occupants so far, so much so that audiences find themselves quietly hoping that a prison break might occur sooner rather than later. If a mass escape did happen, it would inevitably cause chaos on a scale that would ripple across every corner of the streaming landscape. In ways that fans would never have anticipated, creating new conflicts, new alliances, and new storylines that cross boundaries no one saw coming. With that in mind, let us take a roll call of who is currently locked up in the Raft and unlikely to be seeing open land anytime soon. Following his very public and gamma-fueled outburst in Captain America: Brave New World, Thunderbolt Ross did something genuinely noble. He accepted defeat and openly acknowledged that he represents a serious danger to the public in his monstrous new form as the all-new Red Hulk. By the end of the film, audiences learn that Ross has willingly surrendered himself to imprisonment at the Raft, confirming that while he may have been transformed into something terrifying, the man inside still knows what the right decision is. Whether Ross's time behind bars will last is another question entirely, however. When the Red Hulk first debuted in the comics, he was positioned as a formidable and dangerous new enemy for the original Hulk to clash his mighty green fists against, before gradually transitioning into a more complicated and anti-heroic role within the broader Marvel universe. Beyond lending his name to the gamma-powered alter ego, Ross even spent a brief period as an official member of the Avengers in the comics. With that history in mind, there is every reason to believe that the best chapters for both the character and the man behind the raging monster, the former Commander-in-Chief, may still lie ahead. When the actor was asked whether he would be open to stepping back into the role and unleashing the monstrous alter ego once again, he expressed genuine and enthusiastic hope, saying he hoped the character could return and develop into something far beyond a straightforward antagonist. He suggested there was real dramatic capacity to explore the shifting balance between the Red Hulk's destructive nature and Ross's underlying humanity, while acknowledging that such decisions were ultimately not his to make. Whether his sentence at the Raft will be reviewed and shortened remains to be seen, but the noble approach Ross has taken by voluntarily keeping himself away from society adds a genuinely compelling moral dimension to the character going forward. While Ross took the honorable route by locking himself away, one man who truly deserved to find himself in a deep, dark cell is the super genius known as the Leader, Samuel Stearns. After orchestrating the entire complex conspiracy at the heart of Brave New World and standing in the wreckage of his own making, declaring himself the hero of the elaborate game he had constructed entirely for himself, the Leader finds himself imprisoned in the film's post-credit scene. This moment connects directly to the broader tapestry of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, building upon the event set in motion all the way back after the original assembly of the Avengers in 2012, while also acknowledging the various events that unfolded in the background during the intervening years, events that many casual moviegoers will not have followed or read about in the tie-in materials. The sequel throws viewers directly into the action with the Avengers team already fully assembled and deep in the middle of a mission against a Hydra base. Captain America, Iron Man, Thor, Black Widow, Hawkeye, and the Hulk are all present and operating as a coordinated unit, working together to take down Baron Strucker's fortified compound. How the Avengers discovered the location of this base and the precise nature of the experiments being conducted there is not explored in great depth within the film's runtime, but it is something that Marvel had been carefully building toward for quite some time across multiple platforms and media. For fans who want background context on the events leading up to Age of Ultron, or who may have missed a few releases along the way, and given that this was the 11th film in the Marvel Cinematic Universe franchise, that was entirely understandable. It helps to go back to the beginning. It was SHIELD director Nick Fury who originally conceived and championed the Avengers initiative, a plan he believed in deeply, designed to bring together a group of extraordinary individuals from around the world and unite them against the most dangerous and unprecedented threats imaginable. SHIELD, the Strategic Homeland Intervention, Enforcement and Logistics Division, was a highly sophisticated international spy agency that remained in charge of global security after the Avengers first assembled and defended New York from Loki and his alien invasion force. Following the events of the original Avengers, the team subsequently went their separate ways, and SHIELD continued its work, until it was torn apart from within. In Captain America, the Winter Soldier, it was dramatically revealed that the Red Skull's faction from World War II, Hydra, had not been destroyed at all. Instead, Hydra had spent decades quietly and systematically infiltrating SHIELD and various elements of government, embedding itself so deeply within the organization's leadership and Security Council that the entire agency had been fundamentally compromised. Director Nick Fury himself came to the devastating conclusion that the organization he had devoted his life to was no longer the force for good it had once been. In the aftermath, SHIELD was effectively dismantled and reduced to a small, trusted team of operative agents operating under Agent Coulson, who had been appointed as the new director by Fury. This storyline is developed in full detail in Marvel's Agents of SHIELD on ABC, and viewers who had only followed the films would have missed significant portions of this context. Following the events of Captain America, the Winter Soldier, a new and more limited defensive force was established to replace SHIELD and deal with the remaining Hydra forces still operating across the globe, as well as other threats returning in the wake of Thor: The Dark World. Tony Stark personally helped bankroll and equip the Avengers using his own considerable personal resources in the aftermath of those events, bringing the 6 core heroes from the original film back together and establishing a new base of operations at Stark Tower in New York. By the time Avengers: Age of Ultron begins, the team has already been on numerous missions together, consistently hunting down Hydra cells and recovering dangerous technology. All of the heroes have received significant upgrades to their field outfits and equipment in the intervening period. Baron Wolfgang von Strucker is introduced in Age of Ultron as a relatively new villain within the Marvel Cinematic Universe, having first appeared in a post-credit sequence at the end of Captain America: The Winter Soldier. It is in Strucker's base that the audience is also properly introduced to Pietro and Wanda Maximoff, Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch, who are being held in containment cells, seemingly at odds with the world and possessing extraordinary superpowers that no one has encountered before. They are enhanced individuals, subjects upon whom Strucker has been experimenting using the power of Loki's scepter. Strucker is revealed to be a top-ranking Hydra official, seemingly the highest-ranking one left alive according to intelligence gathered by other Hydra operatives referenced in Agents of SHIELD. His right-hand man is a scientist named Dr. List, a character who appeared most frequently in the television series, most notably in episodes that served as direct preludes to Age of Ultron. The majority of Season 2 of Agents of SHIELD is built around the mission of eliminating the remnants of Hydra and uncovering the growing presence of enhanced individuals, something Hydra had made a top priority in its own research agenda. by the episode of Agents of SHIELD titled The Dirty Half Dozen, which served as a direct bridge into the events of Age of Ultron. Enhanced people had become a growing and increasingly visible regularity within the MCU, even if they had not yet become a central topic of discussion within the films themselves. Hydra was experimenting on enhanced individuals in order to understand, harness, control, and potentially weaponize superhuman abilities. SHIELD, or what remained of it, had been tracking this development on the television show, and the knowledge gained there had become a core element of the broader Marvel Cinematic Universe narrative. Quicksilver and Scarlet, which appear right at the beginning of Age of Ultron, and while in Marvel's comics they are mutants, children of Magneto, that explanation could not be used in the Avengers films for legal and rights-related reasons. Instead, the groundwork laid by Agents of SHIELD around the concept of enhanced people and the hidden society known as the Inhumans, people with extraordinary gifts living quietly among ordinary humans, helped provide an alternative framework for understanding their existence. The Inhumans were at the time being developed toward their own dedicated film planned for release in 2019. Several of the early Marvel Cinematic Universe films had established the importance and extraordinary power of the Tesseract, also known as the Cosmic Cube, an alien object of immense energy that became central to the events of Captain America, the first Avenger. Everyone wanted it, but none more desperately than Thanos, the cosmic warlord who had been lurking in the background as the unseen puppet master behind the events of the original Avengers and the villain operating behind the scenes in Guardians of the Galaxy. Thanos had given Loki a powerful mind-controlling scepter to use in his invasion of Earth and his attempt to seize the Tesseract. After Loki was defeated by the combined power of the Avengers, Thor took his brother back to Asgard, but the scepter was left behind on Earth, placed in the hands of SHIELD. As explained in the official Avengers, Age of Ultron Prelude comic, Hydra operatives working within SHIELD stole the scepter and delivered it to Baron Strucker's compound, where he used it to experiment on volunteers in an attempt to create enhanced soldiers. This storyline feeds directly into Season 2 of Agents of SHIELD, and the scepter's power ultimately unlocks extraordinary abilities in Quicksilver and Scarlet, which while leaving all other experimental subjects either dead or permanently damaged. Avengers, Age of Ultron stars Robert Downey Jr. returning as Iron Man, Chris Evans as Captain America, Mark Ruffalo as the Hulk, Scarlett Johansson as Black Widow, and Jeremy Renner as Hawkeye, with the additional support of Samuel L. Jackson as Nick Fury, Don Cheadle as James Rhodes and War Machine, and Paul Bettany in the newly expanded role of Vision. The film was released in theaters in May 2015, and was followed in the Marvel release schedule by Ant-Man on July 17, 2015, and then Captain America: Civil War on May 6, 2016, and Doctor Strange on November 4, 2016. Following the events of Thor: The Dark World and Captain America: The Winter Soldier, Age of Ultron finds the titular heroes on a mission to recover Hydra-controlled alien technologies that have fallen into dangerous hands. This mission brings Iron Man, Captain America, Black Widow, the Hulk, and Hawkeye to the doorstep of Baron Strucker, the Hydra officer who has been experimenting on Loki's scepter at his fortified compound in the hope of harnessing its extraordinary power for Hydra's own purposes. During the assault, the Avengers encounter a pair of enhanced enemy combatants in Pietro and Wanda Maximoff, as well as scientific data that, when combined with Tony Stark's advanced work in artificial intelligence, holds the potential to create a powerful peacekeeping system capable of protecting the Earth from the growing and increasingly inevitable threat of another alien invasion. Despite the solo Ant-Man adventure that follows shortly afterwards, Age of Ultron essentially closes the door on the Marvel Cinematic Universe's Phase 2 storylines while simultaneously cracking open several windows onto Phase 3 and the larger narrative conflicts ahead. The latest Avengers team-up delivers everything that fans had come to expect from a Marvel Studios film: globetrotting adventure, stunning visual effects battles, the ongoing shared universe setup, comic book spectacle, sharp character drama, and the now obligatory Stan Lee cameo. As a result, the movie is an essential and must-see event for anyone, young or old, who has been following along with Marvel's sprawling and intricately interconnected cinematic story. It is bigger than its predecessor in virtually every measurable dimension, featuring refined special effects, a genuinely formidable new central villain in Ultron, and a significant amount of groundwork being laid for the Civil War storyline and Phase 3 more broadly. That said, Age of Ultron will inevitably be less accessible to viewers who are not already well versed in the ongoing blood and thunder of the MCU's accumulated mythology, and much like its predecessor, it occasionally gets bogged down in the complex and demanding balancing act of developing a large ensemble cast of returning heroes alongside new additions. Nevertheless, the core storyline successfully builds upon the films and individual character struggles that have come before it, supplying each hero with their own distinct set of obstacles, whether physical, intellectual, or deeply emotional. Scarlet Witch's power to manipulate minds and force her targets into darker and more vulnerable versions of themselves proves to be one of the film's most dramatically effective tools, exposing the hidden fears and insecurities of even the most powerful and seemingly invulnerable members of the team. The majority of the cast, and particularly those actors who have carried their own solo Marvel films, perform admirably in what is an extraordinarily challenging ensemble dynamic, offering a skillful mix of amusing one-liners, sincere personal drama, and genuinely thrilling superhero moments. That said, some of the most powerful and memorable acting in the film comes not from the characters who have headlined their own movies but from those who have had less time in the spotlight. The ongoing thread of Bruce Banner's struggle to contain and coexist with the other guy, the Hulk, provides a surprisingly affecting emotional mirror for Black Widow to reflect on her own troubled past and the painful question of who she ultimately wants to become. Even more surprisingly, the biggest emotional revelation of the film belongs to the previously sidelined Clint Barton, Hawkeye, who is given the most grounded, human, and relatable storyline in Age of Ultron. Where Barton functioned more as a mindless drone under Loki's control in the original Avengers, he becomes in this film a powerful emotional anchor and cipher for the audience, the ordinary man standing at the heart of an extraordinary and increasingly incomprehensible conflict. Among the newcomers, Aaron Taylor-Johnson's Quicksilver and Elizabeth Olsen's Scarlet Witch are rewarding anti-hero choices, and both performers deliver bold and committed performances that are solid in their respective roles. Despite the well-received and entertainingly scene-stealing portrayal of Quicksilver in X-Men: Days of Future Past, Taylor-Johnson's version of the character is differentiated enough in personality, motivation, and the specific nature of his powers that his storyline feels genuinely fresh, even if certain surface aspects of the character remain familiar from broader genre conventions. Scarlet Witch is an exciting and colorful addition to the MCU, injecting a sense of genuinely unpredictable magical energy into some of the film's most memorable sequences. Yet just as the larger film hints at far more exciting events waiting down the road, many viewers may find themselves more interested in what Scarlet Witch's inclusion in the MCU will mean going forward, what her powers will grow into, what role she will play in the conflicts ahead, rather than fully savoring her somewhat brief and necessarily limited debut appearance here. That said, while the Maximoff twins are properly introduced in Age of Ultron, their backstory and the precise origins of their extraordinary powers are glossed over with frustrating brevity, and worst of all, their specific personal connection to Ultron himself is underdeveloped in ways that undermine some of the film's dramatic logic. This lack of thorough narrative groundwork and genuinely believable world-building is an ongoing and well-documented problem across several of Marvel's films, and Age of Ultron is not immune to it. After all the elaborate build-up, Ultron himself represents only a slight improvement upon the parade of somewhat interchangeable evil overlords that the Avengers have faced before, a villain who, despite dismantling CGI armies with impressive efficiency, remains a frustratingly underutilized dramatic presence given the extraordinary potential of his premise. Similarly, the film represents only a marginal improvement over its predecessor in terms of the quality and variety of its action sequences, though to the film's credit, Ultron does receive considerably more character development than many of his predecessors in the Marvel villain lineup, along with some genuinely witty and memorable dialogue that elevates him beyond the level of a purely functional antagonist. In addition to some generally sharp and clever ensemble banter, the sentiment and emotional register of the film shift somewhat when compared to the original Avengers, with the sheer size of the ensemble, 6 or more heroes at any given moment, alongside Quicksilver, Scarlet Witch, and Vision, meaning that certain characters function more as plot devices to pull the Avengers in new directions and challenge them in unexpected ways than as fully rounded and independently compelling dramatic presences in their own right. Vision in particular, while given some of the film's most thoughtful and philosophically interesting dialogue, does not quite receive the standalone character development his introduction deserves. Ultron, despite his genuinely menacing premise and James Spader's magnetic vocal performance, does not quite reach the level of classic movie villainy that the film's most ambitious moments seem to be reaching for. While Age of Ultron misses the bar of true classic greatness that the best superhero films manage to clear, it nevertheless remains one of the most viscerally exciting and thoroughly entertaining entries in the Marvel franchise to that point, featuring some of the most visually inventive and technically accomplished sequences the franchise had produced. However, much like Captain America, the Winter Soldier before it, certain environments and visual effects sequences betray an over-reliance on green screen and digital compositing techniques that have not yet been fully mastered to the level the material demands, and the film still finds itself fighting against the limitations of the visual effects technology available at the time of its production. Despite the occasional dramatic shortcoming, the filmmakers successfully deliver on the visual spectacle front, producing bigger, more sophisticated, and more technically ambitious action sequences than the first film managed, along with another impressively rousing musical score that propels the action forward with considerable energy and momentum. For that reason alone, Age of Ultron is well worth experiencing in premium format wherever possible, ideally in IMAX 3D or standard 3D. Despite a few narrative hiccups and some sequences that feel tonally or structurally clumsy in their execution. Taken as a whole, Avengers: Age of Ultron is solid and thoroughly enjoyable popcorn entertainment, and it is best experienced on the largest screen available. The long-running trappings of shared movie universe storytelling remain present and accounted for, some of them serving the story well, others feeling like obligatory connective tissue, and the novelty of seeing so many iconic comic book characters sharing the screen together is perhaps not quite as overwhelming and jaw-dropping as it was when the original Avengers first assembled in 2012. Age of Ultron runs for a substantial 141 minutes and carries a PG-13 rating for intense sequences of sci-fi action and violence, destruction on a massive scale, some suggestive content, and mature themes. It was screened in 2D, standard 3D, and IMAX 3D formats. Avengers: Age of Ultron broke a major Thor and Loki trend that had been quietly established and maintained throughout the Infinity Saga from the very beginning. Thor's journey through the Marvel Cinematic Universe had been closely intertwined with Loki's from the outset. Just as Thor became one of the MCU's biggest and most beloved heroes, his relationship with Loki propelled both characters to remain central and recurring presences in the shared universe, even across multiple fake-out deaths and apparent departures. It had become almost an unspoken rule, an implicit understanding between the filmmakers and the audience, that Thor and Loki would always appear together in any MCU project in which Thor featured. Looking back across the entirety of the Infinity Saga, there is only one exception to this pattern, and that exception is Avengers: Age of Ultron. It remains the only time in the entire Infinity Saga that Thor appears in a Marvel Cinematic Universe film without Loki being present alongside him. The Asgardian brothers had previously shared the screen in the original Avengers and in Thor: The Dark World, and they would go on to appear together again in Thor: Ragnarok, Avengers: Infinity War, and Avengers: Endgame. Age of Ultron stands alone as the singular break in what was otherwise a remarkably consistent pattern. This was not always the plan. It was never originally intended for Age of Ultron to break the Thor and Loki tradition. In fact, Loki was originally planned to appear in the film. Tom Hiddleston actually filmed a cameo for Avengers: Age of Ultron that would have seen Loki appear within the nightmare sequences generated by Scarlet Witch's mind-altering powers. This would have been thematically consistent. The same conceit was used when Hela appeared in Thor's vision of Asgard's destruction. However, Loki's role in Avengers: Age of Ultron was cut during post-production as the editing process continued and the film was shaped toward its final form. The reason why Loki's cameo was ultimately removed was apparently one of audience confusion. Test screenings revealed that viewers assumed Loki's presence within Thor's dream sequence somehow implied that Loki was actively controlling or orchestrating the nightmare itself. This misreading was potentially compounded by the significant importance of Loki's scepter to the film's central plot and to Ultron's creation, making his appearance in any capacity feel loaded with implications the filmmakers had not intended. The multiverse saga has since continued to keep Thor and Loki's MCU stories largely separate in a similar fashion to what Age of Ultron did, but this has only served to intensify the audience's desire to see the brothers reunited on screen once more. A reunion could very plausibly happen in the future. Loki Season 2 could easily include a Thor cameo of genuine dramatic significance, and the continuing importance that both characters are expected to play in the broader MCU going forward makes it highly likely that they will appear together in Avengers, Secret Wars or Avengers, Doomsday. Those upcoming event films represent the most natural and dramatically satisfying opportunity for Thor and Loki's MCU reunion to finally occur, and potentially even to allow both characters to exit the franchise together in a meaningful and emotionally resonant way. Avengers: Age of Ultron sits as the weakest installment in the Avengers team-up series, currently sitting at a 76% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes. And yet, despite its relatively lower standing in the franchise rankings, the film unquestionably contributed to some of the most important storylines established across the entire MCU. Its massive narrative scope and occasionally problematic pacing at least allowed several subplots and individual character arcs to develop in meaningful ways, arcs that would later result in films as significant as Black Panther and Thor: Ragnarok. Age of Ultron deserves considerably more appreciation and credit than it typically receives for the foundational work it did in setting up the MCU's trajectory. The events of the film were integral to the culmination of the Infinity Saga, and the sequel continues to exert a lasting impact on the multiverse saga as well. Had Vision not existed, Captain America's defining moment of lifting Mjolnir in Avengers: Endgame would not have been foreshadowed in the memorable scene where he manages to slightly move the hammer during the party sequence, a moment that had the entire audience leaning forward in their seats. And without Wanda Maximoff's introduction in Age of Ultron as Scarlet Witch, her extraordinary character development across WandaVision and Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness could never have taken root. What makes Age of Ultron such a critically important film in the broader MCU architecture is that it serves as a direct and essential precursor to Captain America: Civil War. Tony Stark and Steve Rogers had argued and disagreed about their philosophies and approaches to protecting the world on previous occasions, but the situation with Ultron heightened the tension between them to a qualitatively different level. Tony had kept his Ultron experiment entirely secret from his teammates, and once Ultron emerged as a rogue and genuinely terrifying artificial intelligence, many of the Avengers, including Steve Rogers, lost a significant degree of trust in Tony's judgment. The two characters clash most directly and painfully in a scene set at Clint Barton's farmhouse, where their fundamental differences in worldview and methodology are placed in stark and uncomfortable relief. While Tony's intentions were genuinely good, he wanted to protect the world from the alien threats he knew were coming. The way he pursued those intentions through secrecy and unilateral action ultimately caused far more damage and cost far more lives than he could have anticipated. This discovery becomes Steve Rogers' breaking point, and it is a tension that carries forward directly into the Civil War conflict between Iron Man and Captain America over the Sokovia Accords and the broader question of accountability and oversight for powered individuals. While Age of Ultron only subtly previewed that coming confrontation, it also gave audiences one of the MCU's most quietly significant moments: the scene where various Avengers attempt to lift Thor's hammer, Mjolnir. Steve Rogers is the only Avenger who manages to even slightly move it, though not successfully enough to fully lift it in that moment. That scene foreshadowed what would become one of the most genuinely cathartic and emotionally overwhelming cinematic moments in recent memory: Steve Rogers lifting Mjolnir fully and wielding it in battle against Thanos during Avengers: Endgame. Audiences had to wait 4 more years to see that momentous payoff arrive on screen, but the patience required proved to be an enormously rewarding experience for those who had been following the story from the beginning. Since her introduction in Age of Ultron, Wanda Maximoff, Scarlet Witch, has become one of the MCU's most beloved and dramatically compelling characters, earning a dedicated and passionate fan following due to her formidability in combat and the extraordinary complexity of her character development across multiple projects. Age of Ultron deserves considerable credit and recognition for introducing her telekinetic and reality-altering abilities, even if it took a long while after that introduction before her truly tragic story began to take its full and devastating shape. The film also crucially foreshadowed the incredible scope of Wanda's power, most notably in the film's final battle, where she single-handedly and systematically destroys every remaining Ultron drone with an almost effortless display of raw magical force, confirming that she is one of the most powerful beings in the entire MCU. Wanda's journey of loss began with her brother Pietro's death in Age of Ultron, and her misfortunes continued to accumulate with Vision's destruction in Avengers: Infinity War. These cascading tragedies would slowly leave her isolated and heartbroken, eventually contributing to her role in WandaVision, where she unconsciously created an entire alternate reality around her grief, and ultimately setting in motion her villainous arc in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, where her desperate desire to be reunited with a version of her children drives her to commit acts of terrifying destruction. One of the most important and dramatically rich sequences in Age of Ultron is the series of visions that Scarlet Witch inflicts upon each of the Avengers throughout the film. Wanda toys with each character's mind individually, confronting them with visions that reflect their deepest desires, most paralyzing fears, or most unsettling buried memories. Tony Stark is Wanda's first victim. In his vision, Tony is confronted with his most profound fear, a world in which he has failed to protect humanity and everyone around him has died as a direct consequence of his inability to do enough. Tony had been quietly dealing with post-traumatic stress ever since the Battle of New York in the original Avengers, and his vision makes explicit for the first time the core repetition at the heart of his psychological torment, the fear that everyone dies, which is the fundamental driving force behind everything he has done since, including the creation of Ultron. Tragically and with devastating dramatic irony, his deepest apprehensions eventually came true when Thanos wiped out half of all life in the universe, leaving Tony isolated and broken in the aftermath. Tony's vision reveals that he is far more than just a genius billionaire. He is a deeply human being who wants desperately to protect the people he loves at any cost. This moment would go on to further justify and contextualize his ultimate decision in Avengers Endgame to make the final and irreversible sacrifice, snapping his fingers with the Infinity Gauntlet and giving his own life to save the universe, finally finding the peace that had eluded him for so long. Similarly, Thor's vision in Age of Ultron foreshadowed an inevitable and unavoidable event of enormous consequence. In his nightmare, Thor encountered Heimdall, the all-seeing guardian of Asgard, who continually praised and then condemned him, hinting at the destruction of Asgard and the suffering of its people under his watch. Considering that Thor was supposedly the protector of the Nine Realms, hearing such remarks from the most perceptive being in all of Asgard was deeply and profoundly unsettling. Thor's subsequent quest to uncover the meaning behind his vision led him to the Cave of the Water of Sights, an ancient and mystical pool with the power to reveal hidden truths about the universe, and it was there that he received the crucial information that would eventually explain his role in what was to come. This vision directly set up the trajectory of Thor's solo story leading into Thor: Ragnarok, where it became devastatingly clear that the prophesied reckoning, the destruction of Asgard itself, was not merely a nightmare but an inevitable reality. Thor would ultimately have the chance to at least save Asgard's surviving people and relocate them to Earth, where the remaining Asgardians settled and continued to play a meaningful role in the ongoing story of the MCU. Beyond the dreams and visions, Age of Ultron also subtly and cleverly hinted at the future films Black Panther and the broader Wakandan mythology by introducing a minor